Hello people, this is Chris VK3AML, and I hope you've had a good week, although Melbourne has been announced for another week of lockdown, so it's not too good. The idea behind this, for all of you who are radio hams, is to provide a series of think pieces, a series of bases for discussion, which later on ham radio, which I can stream from my ham radio on my right, will stimulate a discussion that I can stream on internet. And I hope I'm streaming okay at the moment. It seems that we've got no lost frames. The stream is behaving itself, which is surprising for a weekend where everybody's shut in. 9:29, in about 60 seconds I'll be hitting the big switch there to go live on air. And checking that everything's okay. Still 9:29. I'm transmitting this on 147.475 in a few moments, or I will be transmitting this on 147.475, and I see we're streaming okay. G'day Royza, g'day Van Dan. Something special this week which I'll speak about in a minute. Hello, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima in Burwood East in Melbourne, for those who are listening outside Melbourne, and streaming simultaneously on YouTube Live, which you can find if you dial up VK3AML 14 August 2021. That is Google VK3AML 14 August 2021. I hope everybody's had a good week. The numbers in COVID infections this week, I think, have gone upwards of 400 in Sydney. So I'm glad then I'm not there. They've just instituted the 5-kilometre rule up there. We've been under lockdown for a couple of weeks and the numbers haven't gone much above 20, which is good from our point of view. So we still have a captive audience, which I'll exploit mercilessly through the lockdown. And tonight I thought I'd dig out some video that was shot by Dave VK3ASE and myself in 2018, when the two of us did a 9-day tour of the island, Flinders Island, in the middle of Bass Strait, which not many people have been to and even fewer know about, but it is the third largest island, offshore island of Australia. The biggest offshore island is Grotto Island in the Gulf of Carpentaria. Second largest is Kangaroo Island in South Australia. And the third largest island offshore, excluding Tasmania, is Flinders Island in Bass Strait. And what a place. Tall granite mountains going almost to 3,000 feet. 3 mountain ranges. Large areas of flats. River flats and whatnot, rather than flats you live in, and the most extraordinary wildlife: kangaroos, pademelons, potoroos, wallabies, an endemic species of freshwater crayfish, which I'll talk about later on. The Furneaux Islands yabby, basically. And the most interesting thing from a ham radio point of view that Dave and I went to visit on Flinders Island in 2018 was the radio station set up in June 1913 at Emitter. There were originally 18 coastal radio stations set up variously by the government using, in the case of Perth and Sydney, Telefunken gear, which became a bit of an embarrassment when the First World War started. And all the rest were supplied by an extraordinary priest with a staff of about 100, working out of Randwick, running an organisation called the Australian Maritime Wireless Company. Stations were later taken over by AWA, who did their best to suppress the earlier history of the company, which I'll say a little bit more about later on. The Australian Maritime Wireless Company set up ship-to-shore stations principally, all wireless telegraph and all spark-based initially, in major centres including in Victoria, Melbourne of course, with the station VIM, Victor India Mike, which initially was set up in the Melbourne Domain opposite Melbourne Grammar. They had one at Mount Gambier, another at Adelaide, one on King Island, one on Flinders Island, one in Hobart. All of these stations were equipped by the Reverend Father Shaw, Father Archibald Shaw's Australian Maritime Wireless Company, an extraordinary organisation with an extraordinary head. Father Shaw was an oddball, a brilliant electrical engineer as well as a cleric, priest in the Catholic Church. But towards the end of this company's existence in 1916, he decided that he would get out of the priesthood to marry a lady and thereafter live in America. He never got to achieve his aim because he died in mysterious circumstances, and God knows somebody might have bumped him off. It's one of the great mysteries of Australian radio, and not one that's terribly well known. The wireless priest, Father Shaw. But Father Shaw's most intact station, the one that's least been touched and is in most of its original condition, with the exception of the equipment that's been pulled out of the building, is the old station on Flinders Island, which has survived because it's on private property. It was sold out of Commonwealth hands during the Second World War and has been in private hands ever since, and those private hands have only ever used the old wireless buildings for storage space. So consequently you're about to see, I suppose you'd call it the Australian radio history equivalent of the tomb of Tutankhamun. But that after I suppose you'd call it a travelogue done by Dave VK3ASE and myself on Flinders Island. And that will take up the next 1¼ hours. It's quite a long video. I hope not boring. I've taken a bit of a risk with it because my first home away from home in 1977 when I was 23 was in fact Flinders Island. And I went there with recommendations from a prominent academic named Stephen Murray Smith, who had an interest in Bass Strait Islands, and managed to get a job helping a local naturalist and conservationist on Flinders Island named Derek Smith, who was helping a private wildlife trust to set up a wildlife refuge on the east coast of Flinders Island, which has since actually prospered, as you will see. So, first of all, I'll run a video talking about my time on Flinders Island in the 1970s and introducing you via a very old television documentary made more than 35 years ago of Derek Smith, the naturalist, and you'll see what an inspirational person he was and hopefully get some impression of why I was induced to get involved with all of that. So this is VK3AML with the regular Saturday night test. I'll just check that my transmitter's behaving itself. 6 amps at 13.8 volts, that's about right. 50 watts out. And you can hear probably hear the fans which have kicked in to keep it cool. So without any further ado, remembering that there is no commentary on this until I do it live now, I'll go over to our clip. Flinders Island is about 375 kilometres from Melbourne and 175 from Launceston, has an extensive network of roads. You can go 60 miles on the longest road from Lady Barron down the bottom to North East River up the top. And those who are watching this will see what I'm getting at by the size of the place. This is Stephen Murray Smith, whose book on Bass Strait was the inspiration for me going to Flinders Island in the first place. He wrote letters of introduction to various people on the island so that I could get a job there. This is the plane that I took to Flinders Island in 1977, and then we lobbed into Whitemark, which is the main town, or was in those days. That's a photo of it. And I was put up by this lady, Doris Wattleworth, who ran a sort of a local visitors commune. She had a series of houses, very roughly built, a bit like Henry Lawson stuff, out in the bush, and you can see one of them there if you're watching on the stream. I was also helped by Fred Worth, charming old chap who had a mini-moke which took us round the island, and that's a picture of me on Hayes Hill overlooking Whitemark, the main big smoke of the island, in 1977. My mum came over to see that I was doing okay, and she took these photographs. Later I stayed at a house called Forest Lodge, which you can see there. Gas light, no electric power or lighting. I had to get wood going for my own stove, and I looked after, among other duties, looked after wombats, which you see me here petting. This is little Wombles. He was just getting into adulthood, so he wasn't quite as grumpy as some wombats. That's a baby wombat I was looking after, and Derek and my mum at the south end of the island doing a bit of a tour. It is a truly beautiful place. This is Trousers Point. In summer, in perfect weather, the beaches are extraordinary. In winter, it can be a blustery hellhole. That's me on the Patriarch's Wildlife Refuge. They took a photograph for the Weekly Times, Cowcocky's newspaper, and that's Derek Smith, who hired me for the work on the wildlife refuge. Derek had a folk museum, used to do food drops for the bird banders on the outer islands, which you see there. And let me introduce Derek Smith.
Here, cattle provide the backbone of the economy too. Flinders never offered great forests like King, so perhaps was saved in that regard by its landscape. Granite outcrops are a highlight in the extraordinary range of changing scenery, an environment this man wants protected forever.
One of the nicest things about this place is to come here on the night of the full moon and to watch the moon rise out of the ocean and highlight all these lagoons and that in the foreground here.
Derek Smith is Flinders Island's most devoted subject. His homespun philosophy, its most worthwhile export.
What do we want out of life? This is what gets me. You can't wear two pair of shoes, you can't wear two suits, you can't drive two cars, not at the same time, you can't love two women at the same time. So what the hell do we want out of life? This is a beautiful place, and we're relatively free of violence and things like that, and I don't think I've ever known of a crime to be committed against a kid on Flinders Island in my time. Not that I know of, anyway. And what more? Some of these places must be paradise.
Flinders was settled much earlier than King, but never fostered a metropolis like Curry. However, it does have a town centre, a place called Whitemark, named apparently because of a conspicuous white mark placed in the area for survey purposes. Later it became the centre of a post-war soldier settlement scheme on the island. Unlike Curry of King Island, Whitemark still has its hotel, the most prominent building in town, even though it services an island population of only 1,000. Perhaps the most unique thing about Whitemark is that it's home to this man, Derek Smith.
Come on, here. Good. Gotcha.
It's also home to Gordon and Gotch, parents of a bad-tempered adolescent brood of Cape Barren geese. Along with Derek, the geese are the island's best-known inhabitants. As a species, the Cape Barren geese of the eastern Bass Strait Islands owe a lot to Derek. 10 years ago, he fought a pitched battle to stop them being ruthlessly hunted. The cull that was planned then would have pushed them to the verge of extinction. Now they're at least protected from uncontrolled shooting. Many experts aren't even convinced they are geese, rather a separate and rare species of their own. Something of a missing link between geese and ducks. They fly around the other islands near Flinders, but apart from Bass Strait, can be found only in small numbers in Western and South Australia. The geese were given their name because the first sighted were on Cape Barren Island, to the south of here. They're excellent swimmers above and below water, but prefer the earth beneath their feet, especially in a big paddock suitable for grazing. The geese prosper in the peace brought to them by Derek Smith. The human residents of Flinders may not yet realise what they owe to Derek. They tend to treat him as something of an eccentric when he's simply intent on salvaging the heritage of Flinders Island. And like everyone here, it's something he'll do at his own speed. In his hand-me-down Holden, that speed is rarely much more than 40 kilometres an hour. Whether he's on the gravel side roads or the main bitumen, once Derek gets the vehicle into top gear, it stays there all the way.
One of the things about Flinders is there's so many people here that have got no heritage in the land. We get people come in and buy a farm, they keep it for a couple of years, they flog it, you get another family in, and this sort of thing. And of course, I'm only a relatively newcomer when you think about it, 40 years. There's a lot of people that have been born here that are in their, you know, well, there's one lady here that she's, you know, well, there's two ladies here in their 90s that were born here. Well, I suppose to them I must be a newcomer, but I just sort of feel that somebody's got to do something, or there's not going to be anything left for the next generation to.
Derek finds the island a constant learning experience.
Get a good one if I fall down the bloody cliff.
In the process of learning, he's become its greatest advocate and most earnest teacher, expert on its flora, fauna and history. Quite simply, he likes to spread the message and thinks nothing of jumping from the car if he sees something of interest, even when it's at the bottom of a steep slope.
This is the local echidna. There's 5 different colour variations of this one. You get them right down to the stage of where they're white, and the toes, the claws are longer than the mainland variety because their spines are longer and they've got to use the claw to scratch, to groom themselves. And of course they're one of the few remaining monotremes. The platypus and this flora are the only 2 in the world, egg-laying mammal. They lay an egg and they put it in the pouch, and it hatches in the pouch, and then when the little fella gets a bit too spiny to carry, she plants him in the scrub somewhere, and she goes back every now and again to feed him.
Flinders has been insulated by Bass Strait, and for that, Derek is grateful.
And just interrupting the program, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test transmission, currently radiating the audio on 147.475 of a documentary on Flinders Island which Dave VK3ASE and I visited and filmed in 2018, and this documentary dates from the early 1980s. It's of Derek Smith, who was the guy that gave me work on the Cape Barren Goose Refuge in the Patriarchs, which you're watching at the moment, the establishment phase of. You'll see what happened to that refuge when we run the footage that Dave and I shot 3 years ago. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, back to the documentary.
But there are still problems with bushfires and clearing. Clearing operations are wiping out what Derek describes as the native corridors, meaning that plants and animals are slowly being reduced in number. Derek has an absolute passion for the range of flora and fauna on the island. Despite being shy by nature, he's on a crusade and will talk to anyone who wants to listen. He savours every moment spent here. That's a total of 40 years, and he hasn't left the island's shores for the last 8.
What I thought we'd do is we'd go up and net the mirror pond and see if we can get a few of the fish. And there's a Cape Barren goose nest over there with some eggs in it. We might go over and have a look at that, and also go over and have a look at some of the orchids and that are out at the moment. Okay, then we'll go up to the pond then. Let Jenny lead the way, and if there's any snakes, she can kick them out of the way.
No, I
What if we get a crocodile? Who's going to hang on to it? Whoa, that'll do. Yeah, you'd be safer going around the back of it.
Derek's greatest joy comes from the chance to spread his conservation gospel, especially to local schoolchildren. He feels that showing them around the Patriarch Wildlife Reserve he created is an important investment in the future of Flinders Island.
Not a cracker. Yes, there is. Something's moving. The tadpoles.
big. That wasn't. Look at some of them in our dam.
Yeah.
Really big.
See, they're bigger now than what some of the frogs are. So this fella's just about to grow his back legs, you see, when he turns into a frog, see? And when his legs grow, his tail will fall off, and then he's a frog. This is what you call down. It comes, they pick it off their own body, and they insulate the eggs with it. They put it all in around them and keeps them warm. When I was a kid, we used to have eider downs on our beds. You little blokes would have doonas, wouldn't you?
Yep.
You know what a doona is?
If Derek Smith doesn't care much what others think of him, he does care about what they think. Here, that means encouraging young people to think of a future on the island, to try and reverse a dropping population. And the best way is to bring them close to the island's environment. The reserve evolved after Derek's dispute with the island's landowners during the Cape Barren Geese shoot in 1977. In the aftermath, he began a campaign to find an area where the birds and wildlife in general could have a safe haven. That led to 100 hectares on the eastern side of the island being declared a reserve. Derek puts half his invalid pension into the running costs. He also makes do with whatever materials he can scrounge for the reserve's general upkeep and maintenance. Anyone is able to use the accommodation here as long as they're seen to be putting something back into the care of the reserve, or at least getting some benefit from it themselves. The last thing it needs, according to Derek, is for people to regard it as a place they pay to see. Within the reserve, Derek's pride and joy is the grotto he built for his mate Frank, St. Francis of Assisi, patron saint of birds and animals. The statue was donated by a Catholic nun who'd been born on Flinders, so Derek decided it should dominate the entrance to the reserve, on an island which also serves as a breeding sanctuary for birds other than the geese. Indirectly, the grotto offers an insight to this peace-loving man.
Well, St. Francis is as you know, is the patron saint of birds and animals. I mean, the beautiful thing about St Francis, you can explain him to kids because we know when he was born and when he died and who his father was and everything else. And I can explain St Francis to a kid, but I can't explain God to myself.
Well, that was the 1970s. Now let's flick forward to my return visit to Flinders Island in February 2018.
Here we are outside Dave's place, Oakley Road, waiting for our taxi. Is that him now? No, it's not him.
Essendon Airport, an extraordinary survival of 1960s decor, rarely used except for these short island hops and small civil aircraft these days. Still looks the way it was in the mid-60s, as you can see from this old departure terminal. Our plane on the left, a twin-engine turboprop, run by Sharp Airlines, the only airline servicing Flinders Island from Essendon. It's fairly expensive to get there. It costs about $500 return, but I can tell you once you're there, it's really worthwhile. There's our plane. The flying pencil, some people call it. You can't even stand up straight in it. It's quite small. Carries about a dozen people. And as you can see, the flights from Essendon no longer go internationally by any means. This is VK3AML with a regular Saturday night test, and concurrently, if you dial up VK3AML 14 August 2021 on YouTube, you'll find the video that goes with this. Awaiting departure at Essendon, and here we are taking off. Dave and I went down there with the idea of spending 9 days on the island, and we eventually clocked up over 1,100 kilometres on a hire ute over a 9-day period. Quite extraordinary. Taking off from Essendon, a view of the northern suburbs. Through the rather grotty windows of the old Sharp plane, they're a little bit pitted and yellowed with age in this particular plane. So I've had to enhance the contrast through the windows, and at that stage, 2018, I didn't have any sort of auto steadying device in the camera as I do now with the Sony cameras I've got. Looking south towards generally Footscray, Altona, over that wing. In a small plane you get a completely different impression of the city to a large one. There's the Westgate Bridge, the city, and Port Melbourne, MCG on the bottom right there. Meanwhile, inside the plane, Dave was having a bit of a snooze. I was looking around at the safety instructions because in a small plane you're always more aware of safety issues than you are in a major airliner. Looking down the Mornington Peninsula, French Island at the bottom. Now the tip of Phillip Island. This is, needless to say, time compressed. Smith's Beach, Cape Woolamai. You generally fly down the coast, Cape Patterson and Inverloch. At this point you take a slight right turn and go over Wilson's Promontory. There's Oberon Bay. And the tip of Wilson's Promontory, the Glennies. Redondo Island, only landed on about 6 times in recorded history, and there's Curtis Island. So a whole chain of islands go out to Flinders. The old land bridge is not entirely covered by the sea through to Tasmania. Prime Seal Island is the last big island you go past on the way to Flinders. It's a long, narrow island with a couple of huts on it. Not much going on there, and this is the interior of the plane as we were coming down, buffeting about a bit. As I say, my camera had no image steadying system, so this is all a bit bouncy. There's a major mountain range at the southern end of Flinders Island, the Strzelecki Peaks. You can see them there over the top of the wing of the turboprop. And Hayes Hill on the left there is where Flinders Island generates a lot of its wind power. There are 2 big wind farms there. They also have 4 acres of solar panels at a local generating plant. We come into the Pats River Flinders Island Aerodrome over the mudflats, and at this stage the tide was out. Beautiful different colours of the algae that congregates over the mudflats and the seaweed there. Of course, being a propeller plane, it lands at a much slower speed than most jets, so we get a chance to have a good look at what's going on below. And when the tide goes out on the west coast of Flinders, it goes out for miles, as you can see, over the last of the dunes and onto the landing field. And I'd landed back on my first home away from the family home for the first time in 42 years. So this was quite a homecoming for me. For Dave VK3ASE, I think it was his first view of the island. Pats River is actually quite a busy aerodrome. A lot of sheep and cattle and freight go in and out of here. Not so much in the way of passenger transport. Really, the tourist industry has bypassed Flinders Island, I think partly because of the cost of getting there, and partly that people just don't know that it exists. You'll see as we come into the aerodrome building, the departure lounge I suppose you'd call it, that the Aboriginal flag is flying there. The Bass Strait Islands, particularly Flinders and Cape Barren, are really the homelands of the surviving Tasmanian Aboriginal population, derived in many cases from whalers and sealers who shanghaied Tasmanian Aboriginal women in the early part of the 19th century to become their sex slaves and concubines and help them with their sealing. And paradoxically, because of that, the Aboriginal population of Tasmania survives, in spite of all of the myths about Truganini and the end of the Tasmanian Aboriginals. There's the Aboriginal flag there. Now we're in the departure lounge. It's about 5 kilometres from Whitemark, and most people here are meeting their families. Dave and I were meeting a hire ute. Dave very sensibly suggested that a ute would have better ground clearance than a car, and as there are only 2 of us and plenty of our stuff to be kept transported from place to place, a ute was more suitable. It's a display of the local arts and crafts, and here Dave and I, VK3ASE and I, were hiring our ute. As you'll see in a moment, that's it there, the white one in the foreground. It's the lady we hired it off. 5 kilometre drive takes you into the main smoke in Flinders Island, Whitemark, population about 120, but it services a very large area and has a big pub, as you can see on the left there, the Flinders Interstate Hotel, run by the Aitken family since 1912. And right in front of us, the Flinders Island General Store, run by the Bowman family. This is more or less the commercial centre of Flinders Island. Bowman Store, it's been going there for about 100 years, I think, run by about 4 generations of the Bowman family. And over there is a new cappuccino restaurant coming up in the world a bit. CWA building there. And there's the CWA shop. I bought Prue a very nice knitted beanie there while I was on the island. I stayed a lot of the time at the Flinders Interstate Hotel. Dave chose to do camping because it was a bit cheaper. He's a lot hardier than I am. and I like to have a morning shower, so having a hotel room was a good thing for about 2/3 of the time. Window display at the local general store. There's me. Interestingly, the general store had kept photographs of me from the local paper from 1977. I was amazed to see them when I went into the little museum out the back of the store. Bowman's Garage, Flinders Island Fine Foods, the supermarket and the petrol station, and that's taken from the veranda of the pub opposite where I stayed. Lovely old pub, built in 1912 and extended several times. The part on the right there is new. And there's the dining room, a proper old hotel dining room with proper old hotel food. We had breakfast there every day. And the corridors inside are quite a rabbit warren, as you can see. Down one of the corridors there's this ominous sign above a door, "No escape." And to some extent it's true. The upstairs dining room. I think my room was at the end of this corridor. And this is my room. Lovely view out the window of the Strzelecki Peaks and the local post office. And that's the way it was in 1977 when I was last there. This is a last look at the room in which my mum came over and stayed for the Christmas of 1977. And here I am 40 years later. A general view of Whitemark. Only a small place, but very friendly. Everybody tends to know everybody. It's that sort of a place. And the precipitous Strzelecki Peak south of there. This is where Derek Smith used to live when I used to work for him, on the esplanade at Whitemark. Dave actually camped opposite among the trees there. The big cypresses that break the wind from the west. And that's a monument to Derek Smith with a couple of his Cape Barren geese. Would you believe he was that well loved locally? The old Whitemark jetty used to be a working jetty when I was last there, but now it's just used for hobbyists. They don't dredge the channel into there anymore. They use a southern port. And here we are having dinner on the beach at Whitemark, where there are free gas barbecues, as you can see. Free gas barbecues, and I've just had a phone call from Prue a few minutes ago. And out there is the view north towards Emitter. If I ever get it on the right angle. It's a big island. You can't see one end from the other, even from the top of the mountains, which are 3,000 feet high at the highest. It's hard to see the other end. There's our cooking utensils. And the sunsets are difficult to describe. Dave and I set up a little radio station on the beach at Whitemark our first night there, and while having a bit of a munch and a crunch, Dave transmitted on 80 metres back to Melbourne, as you can see there. We had a visitor, a frog, a little fella. And then we went out to the Patriarch Refuge, which you've just seen Derek Smith setting up, just to see how it is these days, and went to the Middle Patriarch Mountain to look down over it to start off with. North Patriarch, this is from the Middle Patriarch. Out there is Babel Island on the horizon. Then I think it's Sellers Lagoon over there. This is Derek Smith's Patriarch's Wildlife Refuge, and you can see we've just fed with pellets the local population. I think these are Bennett's wallaby, I'm not sure. Some of them are friendlier than others. Don't worry fellas, we're not going to disturb you. They are very tame. They've never been threatened. And let's hope it stays that way. Hello. Other tourists. If you want to feed them, there are pellets inside. They're very used to humans and they're very used to being fed. And congratulations, you're now in a video. Probably see yourself in YouTube eventually.
Dave, getting to know one of the locals. They were very friendly, just like little cats or dogs.
You can see here, Derek done this. So did Bruce and Doug. So Derek even built the septic tank for the storage, for the showers and everything. And there's a gas barbecue over there.
I shouldn't...
Gas barbecues, no charge. A stone barbecue place on the left. Here are some of our friends. Hello fellas, how are you? No, I haven't got anything for you this time. Hello, happy days. There's the barbecue. For those of you abroad, these aren't kangaroos, these are actually wallabies. Smaller version. Hello. And there's another couple coming out of the bush now. We get very used to these fellas. Hello. Oh, you are tame. And through here's the A-frame hut. Donations to help with the animals is always gratefully accepted, as you can see. Now let's go inside.
We put in $5.
And here we are. Some pictures of Derek Smith's life there. I must say I feel privileged to have worked with the man. He's a very nice type. That's Derek as I remember him. In the A-frame you've got a gas stove. If you want to make your dinners, you've got provided with cups and saucers and plates. Sorry. You have a sink. For winter, a stove with a bit of fuel. There are always our friends waiting outside. On this occasion, quite a few friends.
Including Dave VK3ASE.
Some reading material. And up the stairs in the A-frame. Just absolutely wonderful concept. Thank you, Derek Smith. Bed where you can bring your sleeping bag. 3 bunks. And that one. It's a bit warm at the moment, so I'll go out on the balcony.
This
At least
was
I
in
hope I can.
This was in January.
I can.
There are lights in the building, electric light.
Solar cells on the roof. G'day, Dave.
Dave filming me filming Dave.
Look at them all. They know who feeds them.
Characteristic coastal scrub. Notice all the xanthorrhea, the grass tree. A brilliant concept. Get people to visit, provide
Down
facilities.
the stairs again. Ever tried to walk downstairs while looking through a viewfinder? It's not easy. Visitor's book.
I'll give you a call if it's to come out the door.
Yeah.
And group kangaroos. So
Okay. Very impressive facilities in the Patriarch Refuge, East Coast, Flinders Island.
Perhaps they've just pushed the boundaries further out.
This is inspecting what's left of an old fence that I put up in 1977.
Go to waste. It's kind of emotional seeing that after 40 years.
The stumps had rotted out, but after 45 years, not surprising.
As you want me to start?
Yeah.
As a 23-year-old in 1977, I was out here with Derek Smith and several other workers, most of us doing volunteer work, putting in these wombat-proof fences around a 22-acre paddock that then was all there was to the Patriarch's Mountains Refuge. That's the Patriarch's up behind us here. That's the South Patriarch, there's the Middle Patriarch, that's the North Patriarch. And this fence was put in, trenched first, mesh put into the ground to stop wombats digging through. Well, judging by the little square wombat doos all over the place here, the wombats have had a field day. But I think they've put the fence further back or enlarged the property a bit so that this is now no longer current fencing. But I certainly worked, some of the first rural work I ever did, some of the only rural work I ever did was helping with the fence. I remember Derek laying out the wire for this, and the electric fence too, that you can see there. 40 years, it's a long time.
Very good.
Then Dave and I did a walk across the lagoons, which being in midsummer were quite
Good.
dry.
Okay.
And as you can see, it was all a put-up job, all of these shots. All staged. Thank you, Dave. Dear, oh dear, I do need to lose some weight.
Just walk past me. Good.
Okay.
There are lagoons like this. You can see they turn into salt pans in summer. Behind the sand dunes, behind the beach on the east coast of Flinders Island. Quite windblown too, as you can hear. Well, you are in the middle of Bass Strait after all. And I'll have to know not to wear a checked shirt. It shows the bulges up too much, doesn't it? This is VK3AML testing, and currently running video of Flinders Island, where Dave VK3ASE and I visited in 2018. Hanging around the Patriarch Refuge, Dave got some close-ups of the locals. Curious as to what a camera was. Wanted to know if it was edible. And that's our hire ute, where we used that for 9 days to go around the island. Diesel. I have seen up to about 50 of those together in a sort of a herd. There are quite a number on Flinders Island. No full-size kangaroos. Watch what happens when I come out the door. I get mobbed. This is the fan club, you see. It's about as close to a fan club as I'll ever get.
Oh, unwelcome visitors. Come on, back you go, fellas. No nothing today. Nothing today. Oh, did you hear that?
Yeah. They're aggressive.
Getting nasty with each other. Hello, fellas. You're sniffing me for... Look at the number of march flies on these guys.
Yeah.
March flies are the main problem with these fellas. These are Bennett's wallaby. VK3AML testing on 147.475. Footage taken by Dave VK3ASE.
They're sniffing the air to see if there's food.
They could look in your pocket too. They were quite curious. Of course, looking for food. A very beautiful spot. Wild. We will get on to the radio section of this in a few minutes. But if anybody is ever visiting Flinders Island, I suggest give the Patriarch Refuge a look. It's worth it. Dave actually wanted to stay at this A-frame building, but we had other places to go to and other people to see. I think Dave was most interested in the wildlife side of things. I was more, I must admit, more into recontacting the friends that I'd made way back when I was living there. So to some extent we were having two separate holidays in one. Lunch at the Patriarch's Reserve. I think we brought up some grapes from Whitemark, which I was washing there at the sink. It's wonderful having sink and cooking and washing facilities right out here in the middle of nowhere. Derek certainly had his finger on the pulse of how to get people to get involved with nature and conservation. Here we are reading the entries in the visitors book. Quite a few interesting people visit there, of course, because it's sort of the end of the plank of remote places within 300 kilometres of Melbourne. Visited by few, very rewarding to those who do visit.
You should get some grapes.
I will.
Once he's done his video. Very solidly built, although it's built out of scrap materials, the A-frame building. The reading matter is mostly natural history and local history. People are trusted with an honesty box to make a donation. Generally they do, and people don't thieve it. Nor do they get many shooters out in this part of the world. I think they know to respect this particular intent of this land. I should have edited this a bit. This is just lunchtime. They were good grapes too. The entrance to the Patriarch's Refuge. From memory we went up the Middle Patriarch at about this time. And that's the main highway out. You can do it in a two-wheel drive, but you have to take your time over it. Or, as we did it, use a diesel ute which had good ground clearance. Classic coastal scrub. Very like parts of Wilson's Promontory, this. And this is the view down from the Middle Patriarch. The series of 3 hills that surround this flat area on the east coast where this refuge is.
On the horizon. And I think it's Sellers Lagoon over there.
shooting video, the two of us. I should mention this is a very good area for RF transmitting too, because there's virtually no noise. On the Middle Patriarch is the internet hub for the island, where they take microwave from the Tasmanian coast and re-radiate it for local people using 5G.
Lee, right there.
I'm describing what's on a map. And that's where we are at the moment.
There's only a few places we can access the east coast. You see, there's the road we came in, and we went across the Stony Lagoon and found all those roads there. Now then you'd have to go a four-wheel drive track. You could possibly do it all the way down to here. Or you can take the Mamana Road down to Patriarch Inlet.
Which is what we did.
Which is worth a look. Red Bluff. Good.
And now the road down off the Middle Patriarch.
Let's just hope we don't meet anybody coming up. I must say the Banksias and the wildflowers are impressive.
Yeah. This is not exactly what you'd call a major highway.
Such an excellent road. I have to make it 4 lane.
O for image stabilisation. Now we'll climb the highest peak on Flinders Island, which you see in the distance there, the Strzelecki Peaks. 2,880 feet. Almost 3,000 feet, and you climb them directly from sea level, so there's a lot of climbing there. I spent a few days in pain after this trip, mostly due to this climb up that cliff face there you see in front. VK3AML testing on 147.475 and streaming a documentary on Flinders Island on YouTube Live. Check for VK3AML 14 August 2021, and you'll be seeing video of what we saw climbing the highest mountains on Flinders Island, the impressive Strzelecki Peaks. This is Dave. We eventually ran into a snake on the track just past this stream, and that's a native Furneaux burrowing crayfish, a Furneaux endemic. Not found anywhere else. The view of Trousers Point and that peaky mountain in the distance is Chapel Island, and this is the snake we ran into, a black tiger snake. We couldn't avoid it, so Dave pacified it by throwing rocks at it, hoping it'd get out of the way. Bang! There we go. Well done, Dave.
Did it move?
Eventually it moved, but we were worried that the angry thing might come back to do us, but it didn't. We just waited for it to get out of the way. And I was out of breath, as you can hear. We have to get up on top of that. It's amazing that we both did it in our mid-60s, but still, there's the view on telephoto looking down on the farmland around the Strzelecki Peaks. Our car looked like a miniature from that height. And that's with a 26 times optical zoom, incidentally. The locals are off-grid. You could see the solar panels that they're operating on there. Now we're getting up around the 2,000 foot mark, with a view to the north, white mark on the left. A skink, lizard, perpetual daisies, everlasting daisies I should say, very pretty. And now we're getting near the summit of the Strzelecki Peaks, and up there the alpine flora is really odd, as you will see in a minute. Wind-pruned, almost perpetually damp because the clouds form on this peak. The winds really scream across Bass Strait and slam into this mountain, which is nearly 3,000 feet high. But we had it on a perfect day when it was virtually windless, as you can see from the clothes we were wearing. Dave on top. We're about to have lunch. The view south to Cape Barren Island. The second of the Strzelecki peaks is that knob in front there. And that's looking east. Dave making lunch. And me sounding like an asthmatic after the climb. 360-degree pan from the top of Flinders Island. It's a wonderful VHF location, as you'll note in a minute. Cape Barren Island across Franklin Sound there in the distance. Badger Island, and back to Dave.
Coffee is served.
Dave had high-speed water boiling facilities, so it was excellent for that. All over the top of the mountain was this coral fungus. I'd never seen it in such profusion before, and you can see why it's called coral fungus if you look at it closely. Very spongy, odd sort of stuff. There are also these little red berries which we never identified. Could have just been tea tree, but if it was very stunted. And that's looking south. Quite a cliff there, you don't get too close. Strzelecki Peaks, the highest point on Flinders Island, and in fact the highest point in the Bass Strait Islands. That's East Kangaroo Island with a few cow sheds on it. Some of the islands are still in freehold and still run cattle. That's the main settlement on Cape Barren through a telephoto lens. Chapel Island, which has a particularly nasty form of tiger snake. I almost said trouser snake. And that's the Goose Island Light, the oldest light in Bass Strait, 1845, way off in the distance in the east. Dave taking in the view. This is me making the summit. I had to leave my pack a little bit below because there was a hairy bit near a cliff. Tended to topple me.
Cape Barren?
We'd been climbing for about 5 hours, I should say, at this stage, so it was quite a walk.
Stable Island, Patriarch. Alpha Sister.
Northeast.
Northeast River. To the trenches. A lot.
Yeah, well, so
I felt blessed.
what's it like to be up here after 40 years?
I'd forgotten how scary the last bit was. It was with the pack on my back, I was getting balance problems. As soon as I took the pack off, no problem.
Yeah.
I didn't come up the way you came up.
Okay.
Even a Baofeng could get through to Tasmania and Victoria from here, as you can see. We were talking at this stage through the Mount Arthur repeater in Tasmania. Strength 9 plus.
Yeah, 73s, Harry. I'll be down there in Hobart in March, staying in Bell Reef. Good heavens, there were little bugs crawling on my hat. I don't know where they came from. And very much appreciate the reply. Very difficult to get a reply on repeaters, I know, during weekday working hours, and Dave and I are just recently retired. Thought we'd better do this walk before we became too decrepit to do it. And we don't regret it.
Neither did we, and this is coming down from the mountain. By this time, quite fatigued, actually coming down, locking your knees on the way down on this steep slope over about a 5 mile, 30-degree angle was very fatiguing.
Good,
the view on the way down. There are islands offshore all around Flinders Island. It's one of the high plateaus on what used to be the land bridge from Victoria to Tasmania. And here's an odd rock feature that looks like a lizard. Now let's take you out to meet the wombat lady. There's a lady named Kate Mooney, a wool classer, whose hobby is raising orphaned wombats. And she lives up near Emitter, about halfway up the island, off this dirt road. One of the things we noticed about the dirt road is that it divides the main island migration corridor, bush, and there are quite a few dead wombats along. Kate checks the wombat carcasses for young'uns, and then if she finds an orphaned young'un in a killed wombat's pouch, female wombat of course, she'll bring them up, and these are the orphans. They are quite delightful.
I think Paddy's getting jealous of the attention.
There is something magic about baby wombats. They have a pouch-sinking instinct and they are very friendly, as you can see. All quite like a little puppy in terms of their intelligence.
Some of them, yes, some of them can be. Mostly at this age they're okay. And the younger you get them, they're easier to train to feed.
Yeah.
Very placid, aren't they?
Oh, they've had lots of handling, but they do end up, being wild. So Derek had lots and lots of handling by all sorts of people. Decided they couldn't take it anymore. But that was, yes, a couple of them had been. Vicky Lane Green found one. She was really upset when it died. She rang up and brought it down.
This is up at Killigrangi.
Yeah, it was 2.5 kilos or something. And
Scene stealer.
The dog was getting
Derek flew up.
jealous of the attention
So
that the baby
interviewed
wombats
Germans.
were getting at this point.
And then after, they'd finished interviewing, the rural reporter put down a radio, put down a microphone, the grey, fluffy microphone.
Very good camera work by
Yeah.
Dave, chasing the wombat at this
It
stage.
was just
And there's
hilarious.
Kate.
And I said to Larissa, that never had it before. She said, no, I've had it weed on plenty of times. I've never had it actually stolen like that.
Beyond Wyberlina, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
For those who are watching the stream can be located by dialing VK3AML
It quite likes
14 August 2021. That's VK3AML 14 August 2021. And interestingly, the stream is behaving itself this week.
Got an article by Stephen Murray Smith.
Yes.
In a book called Australia's Last Frontier. It was published in
It's a green
1979.
book with a, yeah.
And
What are you doing?
It was a warm afternoon and the wombats were sleeping on our laps, as you can see,
Go bite me.
hello.
fully trusting.
Can I speak to you later, Hunt? Because at the moment I have a very small wombat on my lap, and when you rang, he woke up. Having seen how your YouTube clips are getting traction, I thought, will this lady really appreciate me ringing up? And
I get lots of people come up.
I can imagine.
But because it is an amazing experience to actually hold a wombat. People
Yeah.
go to Hillsville and, pay $75 to maybe even stand in the yard
Yes.
to actually hold them.
Right.
Must have rung the shop and got the number and spoke to me, or rang and asked if he could. And so he turned up just this morning, just as I was working, because it's busy first thing Monday morning doing the papers and the magazines and me something. So he
Do
did.
they still pick up extra passengers apart from school children on the bus run?
No, not allowed to.
That I only heard about. I never.
He does all this research, but it just took.
She didn't often mention that.
Your shoelace, your shoes.
And there's the dog undoing my shoelaces. Devil of a thing.
I don't know what to do.
Put it down. Puppy. No.
You've heard of flat out like a lizard drinking. Well, you're about to see flat out like a wombat drinking. This is VK3AML testing.
Population. Your basic population curve.
Work out who took what in the Furneaux group. I think one of the first He knows how to get through the flap. Perhaps I better...
Where's the other one?
I'm supposed to hold it underneath the bum, according to Derek. So I suppose I better do that.
It's a great catch. They drink.
They drink quite a bit, don't they?
There he
They
goes.
don't drink very often when
Slurp,
they drink.
slurp,
Same when
slurp.
they wee. They don't wee very often, but when they wee, they wee.
Ah, right.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, the friend that Lady Baronet has done the little ones. She's moved here from Perth. She's a vet.
To fall in the wombat hole.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
so a
don't
few
drive
of
the
them.
car down here anymore.
Yeah.
And so Dave and I wandered off into the night,
We'll probably see you
pursued by
on
sundry wombats.
Be careful because I think there's a wombat hole.
But Dave's navigation of Kate Mooney's front driveway was a little hairy at that time of night. Now, the old wireless telegraph station at Echidna, west coast of Flinders Island, was opened in July 1913 with spark telegraphy, closed 1942 and replaced with low VHF radio telephone from Hayes Hill and Walker's Lookout. So this is footage taken by permission of the station's property owner, Rebecca Chen, back in February 2018. The first station in Bass Strait was opened experimentally on King Island, and this is the King Island station in 1912. It was opened experimentally by Father Shaw's Australian Maritime Wireless Company, but of course this gave the impression there should be something parallel on Flinders Island, and eventually there was. Father Shaw, a Catholic priest, enthusiast in electronics, and the first person to open a major wireless telecommunications company in Australia based in Randwick, Dutrick Street, Randwick. And he eventually employed about 150 workers in the factory making spark wireless telegraph equipment, generators, alternators, spark gaps, blowers. This is his home, Ascot in Randwick, 4 Dutrick Street, still there. And behind it was the Maritime Wireless Company's factory and a mast, a wireless mast, one of the first in Sydney back about 1909. You'll see it in a moment. There it is, top-loaded vertical with multiple top-load wires designed for long wave, which is where most of this stuff was done. Here are some of the employees of the factory. Father Shaw on the left with a big pot belly and braces. And this is typical of the transceiver equipment, was all brute force and ignorance. High power spark, crystal set reception, no amplification involved. The workshop with some of the workers working on lathes, turning out things like windings for alternators and dynamos. And there's a complete transmitting equipment that they sent to Thursday Island in 1912. Engine and all. Whole thing built locally in Randwick. This preceded AWA, who took over many of the stations. Here's their staff in 1912 at the peak of their employment. The transmitters were deceptively simple. All they had was a 350 Hz alternator driving a spark gap quenched by air and frequently between 5 and 20 kilowatts of spark, and that's where the Flinders Island station was, compared to the others, 18 around Australia. Melbourne had their wireless station, Spark, in the Domain, right opposite the Church of England Grammar School, Melbourne Grammar, and the equipment was designed by Graham Balsillie, who you see in this photograph. Locally designed, locally engineered, locally built. The outstanding feature of the stations was a 180-foot Oregon mast weighing many tons. And there's the one in the Domain, and the building that used to stand next to it, long gone, demolished 1932. This is the lawn where it used to be. There's not a trace of Melbourne's original Spark station, but on Flinders Island it's virtually intact, or their version of it, which is a copy of the Melbourne station. It was built near the old Aboriginal station at Waibelena, which is where a lot of the Tasmanian Aborigines were brought to go into decline. But a bit up the hill from there, where the red spot is, in what was originally private property, and it's now reverted to private property, which has probably saved it from destruction. It was built by a construction camp, which you see there. There's the raising of the antenna in April 1913 with a jockey pole used to pull it up. All of the ladies on the island turned up in their finery to watch it being erected. And there's the erection crew on Flinders Island in 1913, June 1913. They basically worked on low frequencies, very high power, very little tuning, and no amplification. There's the opening announcement for November 1913. The building's under construction, and that shows typical receiving equipment. That's the first amateur station in Burnie, as a matter of fact, Burnie, Tasmania. The operator's home is still there, now extended. Very luxurious home. It was then occupied by the Chen family, who have since sold it. Wireless Hill it's called, the operator's home. And up the hill from there, up a little dirt road, are the two operating sheds, still completely intact after 108 years. The operating shed on the left, the generator shed on the right. Notice they kept the generator shed separate. It was because they were listening on a crystal set and they needed quiet. In terms of surviving architecture, this is about as close as you can get to the start of radio in Australia. This was built June 1913. They brought in a team who were set up in a tent town near here. Tons of concrete, generators for 5 kVA. And now the transmitter shed, which you see here. We originally thought that this was locked, but we didn't try pushing the door. All around it, cast-off insulators, bits of guy tensioning equipment, all just discarded, just sitting there. It's like a wireless archaeologist's dream. This is the back of the building, what's left of the old water tank, a guy tensioner there on the left, and bits of guy shackles. The wooden building on the right was added in 1914. I'll talk about that in a minute. There's the generator shed and across to the transmitter building.
The more I look, the more I
Now,
see.
the idea of that wooden add-on on the right there was that Flinders Island gets pretty heavy weather, particularly in winter, and people wanting to place a telegram needed a dry spot to stand while they ordered it through the window of the operating room. So in due course, this wooden add-on was put on the building in 1914, and there it is, still there, with the window they ordered through still there also. An extraordinary survival. 108 years of weathering on that door. This is VK3AML testing. This is a peek through the rather dirty windows, but we eventually got in. And this is the alternator room. It still smells of kerosene and oil after 100 years. You can rub your finger on the oil sump and it's still greasy. And that's the bed plate where they bolted on the 350 hertz alternator that produced 25 kV at 5 kilowatts for the spark gap. It must have sounded pretty fearsome when it was running. And you can see the splash, oil splash up the walls there. A couple of the old shackles and insulators just hanging around inside the shed, never discarded, awaiting some electronic and archaeologist, really.
Glaze, the triangles I talked about,
And
the holes.
those are the
2 feet holes.
double insulator panels
That's it.
that allowed feed-through insulators while providing audio isolation between the spark room and the receiver room, because the receivers being crystal sets, people had to concentrate to hear the very low-level sound through the headphones. The wires for the racks are still there, hanging off the walls. There are the feed-through insulators between the spark room and the receiving room, still in place. The feed-through insulators above that window are the two wires going out to the original antenna, and heaven knows what's stored in the roof. That was where they stored their spare parts. We're sorry that we didn't get any access up there. It would be fascinating to find out what's there. The original spark gap was quenched by a blast of air from a 2-horsepower compressor, and the spark ran 25,000 volts at 350 hertz. It must have been noisy. You can see there with those red lines where the high voltage bus bars went across the room for the spark. Original lighting equipment for the room, wooden cable ducts with wooden switches and wooden plugs. A lot of them fallen into disrepair since this has been decommissioned for 80 years. The other end of the receiver room as it is now. And the receivers would have been in below that window. That's the way it looked originally. Look up the top, you'll see where those high voltage buzz bars were with the insulators. Now just the wires hanging from the roof to indicate where the racks were. But this is the most intact station building of all the station buildings built by Balsillie and Father Shaw around Australia. Receiver room, transmitter and blower room, rotary converter engine room, all separated by a concrete wall to keep the noise down. That's where the feed through to the antenna was. Now the generator shed. We couldn't get into the generator shed, but we could shoot some video through the windows of it. You'll see that something funny has happened to the back door of that shed. There's been some piece of equipment they couldn't get through the doors, so they had to widen the doorway by chipping away at it. And there's the hand crank from the engine discarded by the door. Unbelievable. The interior, 2 rooms in this shed. I'd presume one for fuel and the other one for the generators and motors. The bed plate bolts are still in the floor. Outside, we found this mesh with this thick wire going to it, and when we saw this photo of construction, we realised the mesh had been there since 1913. It's part of the earthing structure, and it's still there, sitting on the ground with the wire going to the mesh. I checked underneath the generator room and the transmitting room, but they were quite empty. They would have been standby Leclanche cells down there originally, according to what I've read. Their main diesel oil reserve was on that platform, and these insulators were scattered all over the place in bits, presumably the original feeds to the antenna and the earth. There's also some heavy lifting and moving equipment scattered about. It would be interesting for somebody to do a wireless archaeology project on this. That's the inflammable store. And, of course, the bog, which by the looks of it hadn't been used since 1942. Basically, a seat and a bucket. There was also the old mast base. You don't really get an idea of how big that is until you see somebody standing behind it. There's Dave with what's left of the earthing strap.
It's something to see how they did this. There's a big cast base, and then the block that they set the wood onto has been cemented above that, and you can see the impression of where the planks were. There. The wood. Recycle it.
That's what's left of the earthing strap from the old tower. The old tower was wood. It was eventually replaced with metal in 1931, I think. You should see there we go. July 1931, they replaced the original wooden tower with metal and slightly shorter. And that operated until 1942. So all that has been there for 108 years and not used for 80. That bollard was used to tie off a sort of a bosun's chair. They could take somebody up the tower, up the mast, with a rope, and then tie it off on this. So there you go, video taken by Dave VK3ASE and myself in February 2018 on Flinders Island. Undoubtedly one of the most beautiful parts of southeastern Australia, at least in my opinion. It's now, let me see, 10:54, so I'll find something to take us up in the 6 minutes to 11 o'clock when we'll go live with a hopefully a QSO through the transceiver on my right on 147.475. So just hang on a sec, I'll find something suitable to play you. Choosing a battery for ham radio, and this talks about the new trend in lithium battery technology.
Alright folks, so in this video what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about choosing a battery for ham radio. Now this might be a backup battery that you're using in the event of a power outage. It could be a battery that you're using for portable or field ops, something along those lines. But I just wanted to cover a couple of the topics that you may encounter or decision points that you're going to need to make when picking up or purchasing a battery. So let's go ahead and start off talking about how much power do I need? That is a question that should come up first. Well, anyhow, let's figure out this. What you want to do is you want to figure out how long you're going to be operating. And what that means is that maybe your backup battery's got to last 12 hours, or maybe you're going to be out in the field doing portable for 7 hours or 6 hours, something along those lines. So that's the first thing you need to figure out is how long do you want to use the actual battery. And then what you want to do is figure out the amount of time per hour that you're going to be receiving versus the amount of time per hour you're going to be texting. Now, this is not an exact science, but it's pretty important to get it close. Nobody's going to come out and say, I am going to be texting 58.5% of the time, and then actually have that work out to be exact. What you want to do is be close, and then once you have that figured out, we'll be able to apply a little bit of a math formula to that to kind of get some rough estimates. The other thing is a lot of times people will power things other than their radio on their battery. Maybe you're going to charge a cell phone, or maybe you're using a GPS. Or
I'm actually going to cut that short there because that's in 1080p and we're only getting a partial transmission of part of the image. I forgot to resize that to 720p, which is something that you have to do on this particular OBS software unless there's a tab for automatic resizing. Incidentally, just looking at myself in the screen there, the hairdressers, the barbers of Melbourne have been closed for so long that my hair is just getting longer and longer and messier, and there's not a damn thing I can do about it. I'm sort of tempted to get 2 mirrors and hack into it myself. Anyway, with that, we'll start to look at going live on 147.475. If anybody is listening there and wants to hear us in better fidelity, or maybe you're in a difficult receiving situation, try checking our live stream on VK3AML 14 August 2021. The live stream seems to be going quite well. If I can only see the stats here. So, just checking that the levels are right. VK3AML now calling CQ on 147.475. Hopefully we've not bored too many people to tears. And going over to the receiver, Do we have any people for a QSO? VK3 Alpha Mike Lima standing by on 147.475.
Yeah, VK3 Alpha Charlie Zulu Portable.
So far we have VK3ACZ Portable. I'll just change my monitoring here so I can hear you through the mixer to know what people are hearing. Oh, that sounds very different. VK3ACZ, VK3AML. How's your week been, Peter?
Yeah, VK3AML from VK3 Alpha Charlie Zulu Portable. Good evening, Chris. What an amazing broadcast tonight. Where do I start? I suppose explanation of being portable. I'm up halfway up the side of One Tree Hill, looking at the view of Melbourne, using the HT to communicate with you. Hopefully I can be heard by Dave if he's there on the side. But Melbourne looks beautiful. It's a very clear night. Sea of lights. You can already tell that because of lock-up there aren't too many cars on the roads. The moon is about 20 degrees above the horizon, setting in the west, but it's a little bit south of the CBD. The CBD is all lit up with the red flashing lights on top of all the tall buildings. It's just a beautiful view through the trees. Anyway, just quickly, comments on the broadcast. Normally I can get through without needing to see the video because you describe things so well. Tonight, and I don't have the internet at home, so I have to rely on my phone, and I wasn't going to, but from the moment you started to leave from Essendon Airport, I thought, no, I have to look at this, and I'm just blown away by how magnificent the view was that you gave us. Just superb to see Flinders Island. It was nothing like I imagined it. With those rocky hill peaks and all the rest, those very tame wallabies, just astounded by everything you showed us, and you did a brilliant job at conveying it to us, just like you did with the Deal Island presentation for the Sherbrooke Radio Club. I felt like I'd been to Deal Island after I watched your presentation. So anyway, that's enough for the first over. Just thanks so much for what you shared with us tonight. VK3AML from VK3ACZ.
And VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
And hello to Dave there too, VK3CG and VK3ACZ Portable at One Tree Hill. I hope it's not too cold for you there, Peter. I wouldn't like to be responsible for you getting the flu or anything. Are you near the what do they call it, the picnic facilities they used to have up there near what used to be an old lookout tower? I remember that lookout tower back about, gosh, last time I went up there would have been in the very early 80s. I think they pulled it down. It became unsafe or some such. But yeah, thanks. Thanks for the compliments. I'm not sure that they're deserved. And certainly the amount of time I've had this week, in spite of the lockdown, it takes an awful long time to throw together video and make it seem something cogent. And I was worried that I would lose a lot of the radio audience because of it being fairly visual. But I think a deviation into the visual once in a while probably helps. I was trying to describe what I could from what I was seeing on the screen, but there's only a limited amount you can do with that. However, the live stream is working extremely well this week, behaving itself impeccably. I haven't had a single drop frame. It appears that whatever we're doing is working well, and or there's less internet congestion this week for whatever reason. I have no idea. Anyway, Dave, 3ECG, how's your week been, Dave? VK3ECG, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3ECG. Yes, fine, Chris. It was a perfectly pleasant week and very much enjoyed the video. And good evening to you, Peter, as well. It was fascinating to see Flinders Island. I've not been to any of the islands. In here, Tasmania, and it's a shame. I must get to them at some stage. I've been to Tasmania a few times, but never been to any of the islands. As I said, the other islands I've been to with, I suppose, interesting cultural aspects are Norfolk and Nauru, which was a very, very interesting experience. But no, never been to Flinders or King or anything like that, so it would be something I must do at some stage. And wonderful pictures of the wallabies and the wombats. Just amazing to see them like that, and what a wonderful experience working out there, and just helping with that sort of activity for. Fabulous thing to do. The week was pretty straightforward, really. Sort of partly working, and which was good. Lots of interesting things to do. Just watching the news with sort of a certain degree of depression about what's happening, but at least we haven't got the Lambda virus here. We've only got the Delta version. The Lambda version, I think, is appearing in South America, and at the moment is showing some vaccine resistance, but only in laboratory studies, not actually in individuals. But they just don't know what'll happen. I suspect we'll hear more about that version in a little while. Very interesting about Father Shaw. I just, while you were showing the video, I had a quick look at some of the biographical things about him, and well, what an interesting character. And I can see why people were speculating at his demise. Well, yes, I wonder indeed. Anyway, back to you. VK3AML and VK3ACZ on the side. This is VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
VK3CG and the group VK3AML. Yeah, Father Shaw's an interesting one. How can I best describe him? Highly creative, and from what I've read since, particularly of documents that were released after Shaw's death in 1916, with fairly great sex drive into his creative drive. A lot of people that are highly creative also are fairly highly sexed, is what I observed through the years. And in a priest that was like just absolutely bound to cause him trouble, particularly in the Catholic Church in 1916, Mannix's Catholic Church. It is said that certain parts of the Catholic Church, if you step too far out of line, you are dealt with by secret societies. And if I was a conspiracy theorist, I'd certainly think that Shaw might have been done in by the workings of his organisation. He having intended, I believe, to leave the priesthood, marry a woman that he'd fallen in love with, and go to America to start presumably a new life, instead disappears and dies in mysterious circumstances during World War I. At a time, of course, when a lot of people were dying overseas and there wasn't very much attention paid to local murders by comparison. It's a bit like Britain during the Blitz. If somebody got murdered there, at that time it was a little difficult to put very much police effort into it. What do they call it? The Foyle Mysteries or something? There's a series, BBC series, I think, or is it Channel 4 or ITV? I don't know. But Shaw, when the stations of Father Shaw were taken over by the Navy Department during the war, the First World War, that's when Ernest Fisk stepped forward as a leader of what became AWA and offered to take the stations over. And then through the early 20s and into the 30s, seems to have done everything in his power to erase the name of Father Archibald Shaw from the history of radio in Australia. So that a lot of places, including the historical group on Flinders Island, believe that emitter station, the station on Flinders Island, VIL as it was called, was actually built by AWA. None of your beeswax. It was built by Father Shaw, along with 18 other stations around Australia and the nearby islands. But the Flinders Island station, having its property sold into private ownership in 1942, and the nature of the property being such that the station is well within the property and a long way from the front gates, means that that station facility has been untouched for 8 decades. So that what Dave and I saw, we were probably the first people in 8 decades to make engineering sense of that building. I had a little book, I don't know whether it's on my shelves here somewhere, by Walter M. Sweeney, a little book that was published. Here it is. And for those on the stream, they'll be able to see it. It was published by Coles, E.W. Cole of the Book Arcade, Melbourne, in 1921. One of the first local textbooks for professionals using equipment that was built locally. And there in the frontispiece is the operating room of VIM in the Domain in Melbourne. Interestingly, every time I've tried to get a photograph of Father Shaw's equipment, a good clear photograph, they all seem to have been purposely blurred. And I suspect that was done from 1914 onwards, very shortly after the stations were built, because they'd expected German sabotage or something like it, and wanted to keep the details strictly secret. Anyway, glad you got something out of the visuals, Peter. And I'll hand it over to you, VK3ASE, with a pause if anybody else would like to break in. And please do join us if anybody's out there who'd like to chip in with comments or get involved with the conversation. VK3ASE, up on One Tree Hill, on his own, hopefully in a heavy overcoat. Portable. VK3AML with a pause.
Yeah, nothing heard. Yeah, VK3AML in the group from VK3ASE Portable. And by the way, Chris, this counts as exercise. Hi. I'm halfway to the top, sitting on a rock, mildly sheltered from what's a fairly strong north wind now. It's blustered up a little bit. But no, warm enough, all good here. The view is somewhat compensating up at around 1,000 feet here. And good evening to you, Dave. Good to hear you on. You're booming in, but then again, I've got the elevation, I suppose. Hope you're hearing me okay, is the just as important. But anyway, Chris, why my comments, my compliments, I should say, about your video, I think were valid, is because as soon as I saw all this stuff, it immediately made me want to go there. And I said in the previous over that I had a picture in my mind of what Flinders Island was like, but you proved that I had absolutely no idea at all. It's just, well, for starters, it's a lot larger than I thought. And seeing the range of jagged hills around surprised me as well. Coming into land, the huge sandbar, or the tide out, was another impressive thing when you're coming in on the western side. So all that to say, there was a bit of a visual feast. But anyway, just as an aside for a moment, for anybody who doesn't know, the RD contest has been on today, and I spent a bit of time working. Not formally in the competition, but giving out numbers. I thought that I'd try and work all the states. I didn't hear any VK8s, but I got everybody else quite a few times over, and had a lot of fun doing that. And I tell you what, I almost feel like I should be giving you a number. Hi. As I said, I've been doing it since 1300 hours this afternoon, but I'm pleased to say that HF conditions were a lot better than they were for the Trans-Tasman competition a few weeks ago. But anyway, I'll put it back to you there, Chris, and come up with some more stuff to ask you about Flinders Island. The VK3AML in the group, VK3 Alpha Charlie Zulu Portable.
VK3ACZ Portable, VK3AML. And hello to Mark on the stream, John Young on the stream. Who else? Terry Sims, VK3FTJS, is watching on the stream. Somebody calling themselves Ponderoof, who I believe is listening also on radio. So we've got an average of about 16, I think currently 19 viewers, which is nice. And Paul VK3HN, whose constructional capabilities are impeccable. I've seen Paul 3HN's transmitting equipment completely home built, I think Class D, switch mode output for 160 metres. Produces superb audio on 160, and that was some of Paul's doing, I think, working with paddy board construction. So thanks for being there, Paul. The RD contest I did once, I think, when I first got the ticket, but contesting really isn't my thing. The only really good thing about it is it tends to shake out of woodwork a lot of operators who otherwise you'd never hear. And you tend to get to know where your signal is getting to because of the number of people listening and responding, which you don't get under normal circumstances, unfortunately. The Lambda virus, I hadn't heard of that one, Dave, and it's in South America. That's unfortunate because nations which have little disposable income and not much support for governmental healthcare are going to suffer if they can't get the antidote, what do you call it, the vaccine out to their population fast enough. That seems to be where we're dragging our feet. In New South Wales particularly, Gladys has been very slow to lock down and even slower to impose the 5 kilometre restriction, but now that the numbers up there are up to 400, they're heading for a peak that's as big as the one that we had in Victoria last year when there was no vaccine out at all, which is very worrying, because if that's happening with vaccine, it's really bad. And I hope everybody's getting vaccinated. I've had my first AstraZeneca. I'm waiting till the first week in September to get the second, and hopefully that'll have as little effect on me as the first. I think there's a lot of hysteria going on about blood clots, and when you realise how few there are compared to the blood clots caused by even something like smoking, which is way, way more likely to produce blood clots, you're not going to worry about AstraZeneca. And John Young got your first shot yesterday. Very glad to hear it. I think we can all eventually wearing a badge saying I've been vaccinated, which will give us access to international travel again, and I would love to get back to New Zealand. God, I'd love to get there. I don't know whether you saw the video on Invercargill that I did some time back, but Invercargill is a real surprise, just as Flinders Island is in its own way, and I would really like to get back there. Made some good friends who have stayed friends via Facebook and respond frequently to the postings I make. And the guy concerned not only runs the local radio museum as one of their, as the secretary of the local radio group, he's ZL4OM, and he's also, his wife helps to run, I think is the sole paid staff member of Southland Radio, the local community radio station in Invercargill. Paul, I am AZ number AstraZeneca 1, had day of flu-like symptoms the next day, but it wore off by day 3. Okay, Paul, glad to hear that. Paul says, my 160 metre AM Class E and pulse width modulator transmitter is very much a copy of the designs and constructions of Wayne VK3ALK and Laurie 3SJ, both very brilliant designers. Wayne particularly I meet at the, what do they call it, Chelsea Radio by the Bay or whatever it is, run by Peter Parker, VK3 Yankee Echo, at Chelsea Beach. So I see him there frequently. Credit where credit's due. Okay, given, Paul. Okay, I've back to Dave VK3ASE. You're partly working. What does that mean? Working from home from a computer terminal, I presume. VK3ECG and group VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML group, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Yes, well, it depends what you mean by partly working, but I work 4 days a week at the moment, and I'm trying to take a day of leave. I've accumulated a large amount of long service leave, so in my sort of transition to retirement, I'm trying to take sort of 1 day a week at the moment, and that means I work 3 days a week. With sort of, sometimes with my teaching stuff, it's easier to do that from home, so I might do that. But otherwise, I do actually have to be in for some of the more direct activities, which is fine. We've got, our workplace is pretty secure from the point of view of controlled environment for people, because we're an essential service, so we are always checking everything as we should, which is great. But I have to say that even though I'm not supposed to be working on Thursdays and Fridays, I seem to get quite a few emails and phone messages, and what do we do about this, and what do you think of this? So that's not too surprising, I suppose, really. But yeah, yes, I was just thinking of the TV program. Foyle's War was the program, yes, and started off being a very police-ish sort of program, and then gradually moved into being a bit more sort of Cold War in the later parts of the series, I think. But yes, I mean, it's interesting. They talk about the murder rates going down during periods of armed conflict, and one theory is, as you suggest, that serious crimes like murders and things were in fact continuing, but were just never really investigated to the same extent, or missed because of the reduction in able-bodied sort of people who were obviously off fighting instead of doing their policing jobs on the home front. My father was a special constable in London during the Blitz, which is really interesting. But I have actually got his police whistle. And the other theory is that, of course, that a lot of individuals who may be, let's say, more inclined to that sort of violence found themselves actually engaged in fighting, and therefore were not back on the home front committing those sorts of offences. Well, I don't know which is true, or there's certainly some evidence for those, but it's certainly true that certainly the amount of recorded cases of violence and of that type, and homicides and so on, definitely go down during armed conflict. But the exact reason, I don't know. It's interesting thinking about Shaw, because he died quite young, didn't he, really, at 44, I think, and fascinating in some respects, because I just read up the things just now saying he went back to his hotel room having drawn out $5,000, whereupon he had some brain hemorrhage and died. Well, if he had a brain hemorrhage and they knew that, then I suspect somebody did an autopsy. So it's really interesting to find out perhaps what happened there. Perhaps that's something I should have a look at. I've been involved in a few historical reenactment type cases, and it can be quite interesting looking at the some of the factors to why and how some people came to die in unusual circumstances. And with that mystery, I shall turn things to you, Chris. So VK3AML, the group, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Do we have any other breakers? This is VK3AML, just checking to see if anybody else would like to call in. Jeff, VK3VJS, or maybe VK3FTJS, Terry. Either of you there? Each week I live in hope of making this post video discussion a little bit broader. Not that I have anything against either of you, Dave or Peter, please, but it always ends up that something like, what is it, between 16 and 19 people are watching on the YouTube live stream on VK3AML 14 August 2021, and only 2 or 3 on the radio. Perhaps one seesaws the other, I don't know. Interesting that you mentioned the possibility of murders going down during periods of wartime and conflict. One of the people that I know, Jeff VK3ASE, has researched a bit, is an American serviceman named Leonsky, who during the brownout in Melbourne during the 1940s, I think 1942 or 3, had a thing for strangling women. He was a smiling, normal character until a woman came within his grasp, and he would take pleasure in strangling them. Not during the sex act either, just for the hell of it. And rather than receiving a decent court case during the war, he was basically taken away by the Americans and summarily executed, and is buried within, I believe, one of the military installations in Hawaii, which Jeff has visited. My mother used to say that she was working in the city Navy office, I think, in St Kilda Road, and frequently doing late night work at that time. And she was dead terrified that the brownout murderer would get her, hopping onto a tram or something like that in the darker parts of St Kilda Road in the days during the war when all of the lights were switched out. You can imagine it must have been a very dingy place. I mean, even during my childhood in the 1950s, the thing that I most remember about Melbourne in the 1950s is with incandescent street lighting, the streets were very dimly lit. And that really only changed when the 1956 Olympics came along, and there was an attempt to make Melbourne a brighter place to live in. I think a major post-war reconstruction. And 3HN says, Chris, I would call in, but my 2-metre FM would not reach you. If you open up an 80-metre HF channel, I can run 120 watts of AM there, or maybe open up an internet channel. I've been thinking, actually, Paul, of running Zoom concurrently with the YouTube live stream. It may get out of hand and be something that my computer can't handle in terms of throughput. But it's been suggested by a number of people that I run some sort of an internet interaction, and apparently you can stream Zoom via OBS software. It's a bit complicated, but who knows? Leonsky and the brownout murders. Well, with regard to Shaw, it would be interesting to find out what happened to him, whether it was some sort of a Catholic Jesuit plot or something. Was it the Jesuits who take violent, or used to be said to take violent action against people that were against them, or some sort of a Vatican-based police force that took it on. But Shaw died in mysterious circumstances, and surely somebody like him that had links with national security, as anybody in radio would during the First World War, would have been fully investigated at the time of his death under those circumstances. So if you can find anything, it would be most curious. I don't think anybody's particularly looked into that. Many years ago on ABC Radio, there was a series called Bright Sparks, produced by a radio producer, freelancer named Stephen Rapley, R-A-P-L-E-Y, and he did one episode of that series on what he called the wireless priest, talking about his training at a seminary in Bathurst, I think it was, which is where he picked up the scientific interest. And then getting into radio in the pre-First War period, it was not the way we conceive of radio communication now, being a thing of finesse and stable oscillators and high gain receiving gear with high sigma noise. It was brute force and ignorance and heavy engineering. Big generators, big alternators, big spark gaps, high-powered blasting for the air through the spark gap, big equipment, lots of fuel consumption, high power and not much finesse. Not much was known, for example, about the role of earthing with antennas, or the role of vertical versus horizontal polarization at that stage. It was all brute force and ignorance, and the fact that it worked at all, to me, is incredible. Those stations built by Father Shaw, the 18 around the Australian coast, excluding the one at Sydney and the one at Perth, which were Telefunken outfits, really were the first major incursion of Australian manufacturing into radio. And on that basis, they're very interesting. Not much has been researched on them. Very few of the station buildings survive. The one in Hobart does, but hugely modified. But walking into that one on Flinders Island, it's like, with the exception of the racks not being there, probably all the wiring is still in the walls and in the ground, and the ground structure is probably still there. And Dave and I, while we were walking around the Flinders Island station, were saying to each other things like, it wouldn't take much effort to get a spider beam pole onto that old concrete base, run a wire up it from this room, and get onto 630 metres and put this place back on the air. But I suspect that if we did it at night, the rats and the cockroaches and the spiders might be a bit of a horror. VK3ASE, I hope you're not freezing too much up there out in the cold, Peter. VK3AML, with a gap in case anybody would like to break in.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group from VK3ACZ. No, not too cold up here, Chris. Quickly comment on the AstraZeneca or the COVID situation. My Sandra just had her second jab during the week and no side effects at all with either vaccination, so that was good. I did have a couple of days of being a bit off colour, aches and chills and a bit sore and sorry, and after convincing myself that I wouldn't have a reaction too, so there you go. But sounds like I'm getting my second one about a week before you are, Chris, and with any luck there'll be no symptoms, and I don't mind it's pretty cheap insurance as far as I'm concerned. And Dave, you mentioned the lambda virus. Well, I heard about it in the media a couple of weeks ago, and I just wanted to believe that it was more scaremongering because I suspect there's a little bit of that because it creates a big story if you can create controversy. We do need something or someone to fear. Hi. But anyway, on to the subject of murdering people. Well, yeah, I had great interest with what Dave was saying or reporting there before. I wonder if it's got something to do with the fact that you've got a common enemy so that you don't need to turn around and kill each other. But no, what I can report to you, and our poor old editor of the Amateur Radio magazine got into a lot of trouble for mentioning this, I believe, because there's a big apology if you read the Wireless Institute website. But ever since this most recent lockup by our state government here, I've been getting at least 2 to 3 scam calls a day on my mobile phone. And it's everything from the recorded message saying I'm going to be arrested for tax evasion unless I press button number 1. I'm going to be arrested for dodgy financial transactions. I had one that actually looked so convincing I had to check with my bank that it was that my debit card hadn't been frozen because of fraudulent transactions. But these things are just going through the roof. And I'm guessing that's because the people that normally break into houses to fund their drug habits or whatever are having to resort to other means. I may be completely wrong. I know this stuff goes on anyway, but I'm just despairing at the number of calls I'm getting that are just scam in nature. They're not coming in as emails. They're actually coming in as voice calls on my mobile phone. So there you go. I think we're in a kind of a war zone, if I can...
Hello? His batteries are flat, I think. You still there, Peter?
Oh, sorry, I think I dropped out. I got a self-timer on this HT. What did I get up to?
You're talking about murders and stuff like that. And spam calls.
Sorry. Yeah, I was relating my experience with the number of scam calls I'm getting on my mobile phone, suggesting that the people that indulge in illicit drugs now have to finance their habits some other way, and it's just been despairing at the scam calls I've been getting on my mobile phone. VK3AML in the group, VK3ASE.
Yeah, we've been getting a few, not that many. Prue has the family mobile. I whenever I need to use it, I borrow that. But I very rarely use a mobile phone, I must admit. Mostly when I go out, I want to be away from the bloody thing. Am I unique in that? I don't know. If you can hear a rumbling in the background too, I've just put on the fan heater. I've decided I can't stand the cold room anymore, and it is a cold night. I'm amazed that you're out there up 1,000 feet and exposed to the winds. You must be a very brave man, Peter. I'll be interested to hear next time round what your handheld rig you're using, because your equalisation is totally different to Dave. So every time you come on, I have to flick an equalising control on the on the mixer. Spam calls, not very much of that. Not very much of anything here. Maybe they've put you on some sort of a list somewhere. You've managed to get yourself on a list. The only thing I get constantly is my wife, Prue, tends to buy stuff. By that I mean films from Netflix or whatever. Or I'll just have a look at my emails. There are some, we constantly get emails from one or two places. Netflix, Qantas Holidays, Big W. Once they've got you on the list, you'll never hear the end of it. Coles at Flybys, that's another one. And that's about 2/3 of the mail that we receive each day. We receive about 2 or 3 emails from friends and about 4 or 5 from Coles, Qantas Wine, AGL Energy. And it's not bills or anything, it's just them saying, what good people we are and do you want this special deal? And invariably it's no, no, no. They must have some dumb bunnies that use it to justify that sort of behaviour, I guess. Just getting back to Father Shaw, the way I see it with Australian radio history, you have that period prior to 1910 where a number of talented individuals, like, as we discussed a few weeks ago, G.W. Selby and Calder Oliver, Henry Sutton in Ballarat, later in Alma Road, Caulfield, were setting up spark transmitters and doing experiments of various types on wireless telegraphy. There would have been only maybe a dozen of them around Melbourne experimenting at that very early period. But then, about 1910, with the experiments from the Wentworth Hotel in Sydney, and then later by Father Shaw and by the people that were encouraged into radio by the existence of coastal stations. People just wanted to eavesdrop, really. There was a tremendous upsurge in interest in radio, particularly ham radio, between 1910 and 1914. And many of those who were involved with ham radio pre-First World War were also the pioneers of broadcasting during the 20s, when it went to radio telephone. So Father Shaw was really the harbinger of a whole new phase of Australian activity in radio, and I'm amazed that there hasn't been more serious research on him. Serious legal research as well. Dave VK3ASE, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. I think I've sowed the seeds of something there, Dave.
Yes, VK3AML and the group VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Yes, I think so. I'm starting to do a bit of background looking around. It's always interesting hearing this conversation and then quickly being on the internet at the same time and whizzing around having a look and so on. It's fascinating. And just to mention, Peter, your signal's very strong here, and yes, there's a very different audio from normal, of course, but you're probably almost full strength here, whereas Chris is quite down from my location here. So a very strong signal, but a very different audio, of course, and equalisation on the handheld, as Chris was noting. Yes, okay, with the vaccines and stuff. Yes, I had my second one 2 months ago now, so for the AZ, and yes, the first one I certainly had that sort of start about sort of, I don't know, 9 or 10 hours after the vaccine, and felt a bit under the weather for about 24 hours. Took a couple of Panadol, it was fine, and not much else. And the second one, I didn't even know I'd had it really. Just completely no effects whatsoever. I think with they say with Pfizer it's the other way around a bit. So the first one's fine, but you can get a little bit of reaction on the second one. So there we are. Yes, I don't know to what extent lambda is going to be a problem, or if that particular variant will be a problem or not. I mean, I suspect there's quite a few variants appearing all over the place, and that will happen. Normally, what happens with viruses is they become actually less harmful as time goes on, but they may be more transmissible, of course. So it's certainly sort of some variations and patterns. Yeah, actually interesting running Zoom. I mean, if I don't know that Zoom is that intensive on hardware. I could be wrong, but I've been doing lots and lots of Zoom, mostly for teaching, and certainly I've had sort of 100 people in a lecture on Zoom, and it's difficult to manage breakout groups where you have sort of 10 or 12 breakout groups, each with sort of 9 or 10 people in them, and then you have, as a host, you can move around from breakout group to breakout group and set timers on them and cancel and so on, and bring everyone back together again, then send them all out to the breakout rooms, and it's a bit of a business, but and you do actually need someone to assist you, because if you're doing it yourself and trying to do the teaching as well, it's practically impossible. So it's good to have some assistance with that side of things. But I wasn't sure that it's that intensive on the hardware, but I don't know what it'd be like if you're putting it through the other software. So yeah, that could change things a bit. Yes, on the spam calls is interesting. I'm not sure it relates to the lockdown, but I was watching something the other day, the Jolly Roger Telephone Company. I thought that was a rather nice name, and this was actually, I saw it on a TED Talk originally. This guy has basically set up a sort of an AI system where you can have your calls answered remotely by their AIs. You can choose, I think, the type of AI you have, where it's a bothered mother with a teenage daughter who's misbehaving and wants this and wants that, and is going out, and sort of argument ensuing, and then she sort of comes back on the call and says, look, I'm sorry, I'm completely distracted by my teenage daughter. Can you start all over again, please? And this goes on and on and on with ums and yes and are you sure and things like that. And it actually fits into the conversation, and it keeps these people on the line for ages and ages when there's actually nothing happening. So and you can record them apparently and listen to them later if you really want to. So that was quite amusing. Yeah. What else? I had a look at the brownout. That's a really interesting issue. So he was somebody who was hanged in Pentridge. Where was it? What happened there? Yep, in Pentridge, and that was really very interesting. And as you say, eventually buried in Hawaii, having been moved around a bit, I gather. So yes, it's really a fascinating story, but something to do with women's voices. He was fascinated by women's voices, apparently. Anyway, but very strange. But there again, I think that area of psychiatry is certainly not something that I'm that knowledgeable about, and the behavioural issues are very complex in a lot of these strange characters. Anyway, back to you there, Chris. VK3AML and the group VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
VK3ACZ, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. I hope never to have to deal with anybody like that. In fact, with forensics, I suspect every now and then you're forced into contact with people that probably you'd prefer not to be. Never heard of breakout groups with Zoom. I think the one problem that Zoom provides me with is that unless you pay for it, it automatically times out in 1 hour. At least that's my experience of it. I may have to fork out a bit of cash to keep it going more than an hour. I know that when Prue has get-togethers with her old nursing friends, which happens every now and then, that she has to restart Zoom. You can restart it and use it for another hour, but you'd have to pay a little for it. Is there any alternative to Zoom? I don't know. The one thing I have against most of the internet systems is latency. I mean, for example, the latency I've got on this YouTube live stream is around about 20 to 30 seconds, but it's intentionally built into the software to avoid the possibility of crashing out with a stream owing to internet congestion. I could set it shorter, but it would make the stream flakier. And as we've had a few crashes over the last month or so, I try not to do that. Van Dan Escobar says, check out Jim Browning or Kitbag on YouTube where it comes to scams. Interesting. Jim Browning. Don't know anything about that. Kitboga, whatever that is. Okay. Take your word for it, Van Dan. Nice to see you there, by the way. But yeah, I'll look into ways and means of incorporating a YouTube non-ham radio feedback to this. But the reason I want to continue to run ham radio is that it gives... How can I put this? It gives this stream a kind of legitimacy that it would not have if it didn't incorporate the radio content, and the radio content has a legitimacy that it would not otherwise have because it has the internet alternative. I don't know whether I'm making sense there. What I'm trying to say is that the combination of multiple different media platforms these days has certain advantages. I try to incorporate ham radio because my interest is in ham radio, and I like to talk about issues that are predominantly radio or communications or electronics related. And while tonight's was a bit of an exception, a lot of it was travel, we did still cover VHF communication from the top of the highest mountain on Flinders Island, which is quite high, about 2,800 feet. Considering you have to walk that straight up from sea level, it's a long way to walk. And The other thing, of course, was Father Shaw, who I've always found a fascinating subject, and sure that there's a lot more to be dug out there. I would love, for example, to find whether any radio museums have preserved items of Shaw equipment, receivers or whatever, unlike anybody would have preserved the spark transmitting gear, because it was so big and so heavy. They would have found other purposes for repurposing the generating gear or the alternators, surely, or even the value of them for scrap, because they were damn big devices. As you could see from the bolts in the floor, the bed plates for those things were about 3 feet by 3. So they must have weighed several hundredweight, and getting them into Flinders Island from the ship must have been a real job. And I think that's where those steel wheels we were finding around the place came in. They probably were on the base of a very hefty wooden frame originally that the things could be wheeled about on. Now, Zoom, we've covered that. Foils War, yes. Good series, Foils War, I think. And a lot of things happened during wartime that there would be more attention paid in other periods. People have their minds in different directions. I think, I won't go any further with that. VK3ASE and the group, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about how you got up there, Peter. I'd be interested to know, did you go up the Mount Dandenong Tourist Road, walking the gutter up those Devil Elbow, or did you go up the 1,000 steps, in which case you're a lot fitter than I? VK3ACZ, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group from VK3 Alpha Charlie Zulu. No, not quite that far round. No, it's just the tracks that go up the side of the hill from Ferntree Gully. And in fact, I'm about to head back there shortly. I've just noticed the moon is set below the horizon from this vantage point, and it had the half moon had this ghostly sort of a dull orange colour to it as it was going through the last of the extra layer of Earth's atmosphere there. It was quite a sight too. And on the subject of the serial killer, the American serviceman during the Second World War, I remember my grandmother expressing to me how she'd been concerned as well. And the scary thing I find about psychopaths and the more extreme narcissists is that they scrub up very, very well. And they've got that rat cunning, and they're able to charm the pants off lots of people. And of course that makes sense too, because they wouldn't get their victims if they weren't able to completely charm them. So it's just a scary part of psychiatry. I wish there was some sort of blood test, or some sort of way of screening those sort of people, because it's pretty frightening. But anyway, I'm going to start heading down the hill, Chris. I'll still be able to hear you. I don't know if I'll hear Dave. And if you're still going when I get back to the QTH, I'll join back. Otherwise, I'll say my 7-3 to you both now, and catch up with you next week, if not before. Thanks again for your broadcast and the chance to have the chat with the three of us tonight. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ 7-3.
VK3ACZ, VK3AML. I've got a report on radio from Paul 3HN. I think Paul is up Eltham or Montmorency or Diamond Creek Way, down in a bit of a valley. He said he has no copy of 3ACZ. 3AML is noisy readability 4 to 5. But he has an HF-AM transmitter for 80 metres, which runs 100 watts, or can run 100 watts. So what I will do next week, Paul 3HN, if you're around, I'll fire up my FRG 7700, which works fairly well on AM. If you can give me a frequency to listen to on text, maybe 3670 or something up the top end of 80 where not too many people go, we might give that a... He's Eltham, not very clear. I might give that a bit of a try next week for 80 metres, tying you in as crossband. if that's okay, Paul, I can probably do that. I'll fiddle about using another bloody mixer input for the 80 metre receiver, and we should be able to tie you in pretty well with that. The only problem will be return feed, I suppose, from here. Gee, I should pull the finger out and get that Anand transceiver going, shouldn't I? That will answer a lot of the problem. You suggest 3686 megahertz AM. Okay, 3686 is 3HN. And so, yeah, okay, let's try that. Next Saturday, 9:30, I will come on with a receiver tuned to 3686. If I haven't got a huge amount of video material to run, and I had a lot this week compared to most, we'll try for some sort of cross-banding that way, and I'll see if I can improve the signal somehow on VHF. What I should do is perhaps tie in a repeater somewhere. I'll have a think about that. I have no means of transmitting on 80 metres at the moment, but I should tie that in. In fact, 80 metres would give, I think, a lot of people who are outside the 2 metre service area more of a chance to get in. You can listen on YouTube stream in Cairns. Yes, but with a 30-second delay, it might be a little bit problematic unless we run it kind of like simplex, Paul. You could really trip over yourself with a 30-second delay between receive and transmit. But I'm glad that you're there anyway, Paul. And we must get together for me to have a good look at what you're doing with the Class E stuff. I know what Class D is, and I probably could get it going, but Class E involves phase shifting in the PA stage, and you would really need a good crow and a lot of knowledge to set it up properly, I think, unless I'm very much mistaken. Class E as opposed to Class D, and I think the difference is efficiency, but not by much. I think Class D is something like 85% efficient, and Class E can be 95% or something like that on AM. But it's a hell of a lot better than the 60% you get out of an 807 Class C stage. What else is there to comment on? Not much. So who's next? VK3ASE? I think if it's not, could you hand it over to ACZ? VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML, VK3ECG. Yes, I think Peter was wandering down, so he said he would try and copy, but he might lose me, I suppose, if he's coming down the hill on the other side. I presume I can be heard quite easily, yeah, so he, I think, was not going to come back unless we were still going when he got back to the shack. Yeah, 80 metres would be quite good, I would have thought. Certainly would get a few other people from around Melbourne on, and that might well help. I just don't. If you, of course, you can still go back out on the YouTube, but again with the delay, it does make it pretty tricky. As you said, probably your SDR transceiver is the way to go, and then you can link everything through with all the audio feeds on the computer and mix it all much more easily, I suspect, than having endless other bits of pieces of kit going in and out. I've looked at that in the past, and I've never really gone down that path, but certainly sounds fascinating, and the ability to actually start to really fiddle around with what's going on, both on transmit and receive side, and seen some wonderful demonstrations, and certainly the Kiwi SDR stuff is fascinating to listen to, and checking that you're getting out yourself, which is always good. but also being able to explore where you're getting out to by just connecting to different receivers around the world. That's really fascinating. A bit like a sort of not quite a reverse beacon, but with the internet delay, it's almost a bit like that. As long as you keep your test transmissions relatively short. But there we are. Yeah, so I can see why that would be good. Zoom can be used in a whole variety of different ways, and yes, you're absolutely right. I think you're limited to an hour, maybe even less than that. But and yes, you can stop and start it again and restart for another hour. Yes, when I'm doing it, I do have Zoom on my computer, but I actually effectively link into the university Zoom. So I sort of I'm just become a user of that rather than I mean, I'm using the program on my computer, but because I'm logging in through the university account, then effectively I don't have any time constraints on it. So you can run 3-hour sessions, although I think 3-hour sessions for Zoom is a bit much for everybody, in my view. But and the great thing, of course, is you share your screen, and so it can be quite dynamic. I was actually looking. My wife's really into this software, is it Canva, which is a presentation type software, but you can do lots of graphic design stuff and import PDFs, and then you can edit them. And she's into a lot of the crafts and things like that. But one of her groups uses, and I can't think of the name of it, it's a sort of Chinese sort of version of Zoom, I think, which doesn't have the time limits. I'll ask what it is and let you know. But how usable it is, or how easy it is to configure, and what the options are, I'm not sure. But they're certainly all the rage. WebEx is the other one that we do use from time to time. That works pretty well. But probably Zoom is the most commonly used one. And I mean, I think their share price went through the roof once the lockdown started to bite, because just everyone was using it. And if you're a Microsoft site, of course, then you finish up using Teams. But the other thing I was fascinated by recently was I was having a look at the the Microsoft virtual machines, or machines in the cloud. So it's not just cloud storage. You actually have your computer in the cloud and your network in the cloud if you want to. But and you can literally just use your remote desktop software on whatever device you like, PC or Mac, and effectively you just basically connect into a network machine, and you can book it as much as you like. Once you've configured your machine, you can say, well, I'll only be working between 9 and 5 or something like that, so I only want a machine then, so you only pay for that period of time that your machine exists. So it's absolutely fascinating. I thought it would be horrendously expensive, and it isn't cheap. But I suppose if you're one of those people who, or a commercial organisation, you're basically thinking about rolling out large numbers of PC upgrades every now and then, I suspect something like that could be financially quite useful. But as I said, I've never really played with any of those things. But it's interesting to think about the possibilities. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3 AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
We got any other breakers? VK3 AML standing by.
VK3VJS has been listening on and off, Chris. I've been watching the Battle of the Clans on SBS, and as I don't have any Scottish blood in me that I know of, it hasn't got my dander up. So, but I have been listening on and off, Chris, but I'm just about to depart and have a shower. Back to you, VK3AML and the group, VK3VJS.
No worries. You heard what we said about Leonsky, I suppose?
The brown-out strangler.
Yes, that's the one. And you've been to his grave, I hear.
Yes, it's at the Schofield Army Barracks Post Cemetery, behind a privet fence facing away from the flag, with a few other gentlemen of ill repute lying there as well, Craig.
Okay, so they must have put his body on ice and shipped it out or something.
Well, when he was hung at Pentridge on the about a week after my third birthday, I think it was, 9th of December, 9th of November 1942, he went out to Springvale, where somebody knocked off his dog tags. Then they collected all the bodies of the servicemen that had either been hung or shot for various offences, and reburied them up out of Brisbane at a cemetery, and then they disinterred them, I think that's the proper word, and then buried them all out at on the island of Oahu at the Schofield Army Barracks Post Cemetery. So they're all out there, Chris, Brake.
Gosh, so he did more bloody travelling in death than he did in life.
Yeah, for a boy from the Bronx. And it was the liquor. It was the dreaded Australian beer, which in those days was brewed naturally instead of chemically like it is now, mixed with various other sorts of alcohol and milkshakes and all sorts of things that drove him to at least 3 murders in a 2-week period in 1942, Brake.
God, when I used to get on the sauce when I was in my 20s, I never felt like murdering anyone.
Well, as one of the chaps before said, he had an attraction to the woman's voice and he wanted it. And the only way he could get it was to grab them by the throat and try and strangle it out of them, which he ended up doing 3 times.
God. Oh, well. These days, I think Dave 3ASE would have been investigating. Oh, dear. Yes, so round to Dave. Have you ever dealt with stranglers? VK3ASE, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Well, yes, I suppose so. Pretty much everything, really, one way or another over the years. It's one of the nice things about, coming to retirement is you don't have to do quite so much of that hands-on component, and a bit more sorting out and organising and, quality assuring and auditing and all that sort of stuff, which sounds boring, but actually can be quite interesting because you see everybody's work, which is really quite fascinating. But yes, that's right. I understood he was moved around a bit in Australia before he was taken overseas to the Pacific sort of centre. That's where they actually have all the anthropology work for skeletal remains, because they still are finding servicemen even today. And unlike British and forces, where they basically had the general regulation that people who died in battle were essentially buried where they fell. I mean, in that field of battle. And whereas the US always had a policy of returning everyone home, which means that they are still working on skeletal remains that get uncovered on Pacific Islands and so on to this day, and identifying them and repatriating them. So it's actually an interestingly different philosophy of working, which I find fascinating. I think the delays would make things pretty tricky for running a Zoom. One of the things we tried to do with my scene group was to use Zoom for not rehearsals as such, because the delay makes it impossible for people to stay in time. and the delays for some people, of course, could be quite long, so they could sort of come in several bars later than everyone else, which wouldn't really lead to a very useful rehearsal. But so what we actually did was we had arranged, lots of performances sort of structured and planned for the year and then and we'd hired soloists, in fact, for a lot of these concerts well in advance, because you have to do that with soloists. And so what we did is every fortnight we had one of the soloists we'd hired during the year would come on, and we'd have a sort of an hour's interview with them, with the conductor basically holding the interview, talk about their career, how they got there, ask them for tips and tricks and things like this. And they were very, very entertaining and fascinating interviews. And then the choir there might be sort of 40, 50, 60 people on Zoom, would ask them questions as well, and then we'd go into little breakout groups. So it actually was, it was every sort of fortnight, but we had, probably a couple of hours of really quite interesting sort of background, and enable people sort of to keep together and keep, finding out what each other was doing in a way that wasn't possible where you just weren't meeting up for rehearsals and things like that. So fascinating, actually. So there are some good things about Zoom, but when you see all these wonderful things on television where they have all these people singing all together remotely, it's a very complicated affair, as you can imagine. And essentially what happens is everyone just has a backing track and they sing to it and then they send it in. And some poor person has to sit there and edit the whole lot together and actually, of course, blank out the few people who don't get it right and things like that. I'm sure there's a few of those. VK3AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Yeah, well, VK3ECG, VK3AML. Latency is a major problem with all digital communication systems. It's the one thing, in spite of its primitive nature, that radio has going for it. It's instantaneous, and it's easy to organise duplex operation if you know what you're doing. So that's an interesting point. Just before I hand it back to 3ACZ, and I'm sorry you're probably wandering around down the 1,000 steps or whatever, Peter, on your way back to your car, wherever it might be, or home, I had a very interesting discussion with a friend of mine who's a real estate agent, who on occasions has actually acted as our real estate agent when we were selling my mother's house, for example. He's one of the few that I would say is an honest real estate agent. He makes enough money out of it that he doesn't have to be dishonest. He can stretch the truth, and he's often told me how he does it within the law. But I was asking him why, in spite of serious predictions last year that there would be a slump in the real estate market, why it has gone 20% exactly in the opposite direction to what was predicted. And he said it's probably related to sociology in a very complex way, in that people have finally discovered that they can work from home, number one, which means that the need to be in the inner city suburbs for a lot of people is no longer the case. It means that a lot of people are going bush and taking their workstations and their electronic means of communicating with their bosses and work with them. It also means that houses have to be adaptable to a computer room and a workstation as never before, so that house organisation and the size of the house has to be slightly larger to accommodate the workplace. Because a lot of people have families and have to work, so they have to have a means of shutting, for example, the wife and the kids away while they're actually trying to get their work done. And that's not so easily done in a small house or an apartment. So the whole apparent structure of the price structure of various places is changing. The country is becoming more desirable. Large houses are becoming more desirable. Inner city living and high-rise living is becoming less desirable. So there are major shifts occurring at the moment, both in the workplace and in home values, and that's one of the reasons. In other words, may you live in interesting times is a curse, and we're being cursed at the moment. VK3ACZ, where are you at this stage? if you're still on. VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group from VK3ASE. You might notice a bit of difference in my audio. I just walked in the shack, as you said that you were going to see where I was, so all good. And I heard both Dave and Jeff perfectly while I was walking through the suburban streets. Very interesting what Jeff knows about... I have a mental block on that American serviceman's name. I just cannot remember it, but I certainly remember about him. Interesting, too, that he ended up going back to Hawaii. You'd think that somebody who'd shamed the nation like that may not be in death worthy of the same privileges that they give to their honourably departed servicemen, but there you go. Still a scary story all the same. And I'd say it would be a very sobering thought looking at the grave of somebody so infamous too. Anyway, while I recover my equilibrium completely from my very fast walking, I'll hand it back to you, Chris, VK3AML and the group, VK3ACZ.
No worries. Yeah, thanks. Glad that you've come back from that okay and that nobody has come up and assaulted you for being on the air. There's one occasion many years ago I was on UHFCB, perhaps that was the difference, walking along the side of a street. It was Canterbury Road actually in Surrey Hills, talking on the radio, and it was I was walking along the footpath, no trees on the verge, just a nature strip, and one of the cars, obviously a CB whacker, actually drove off the street with one of his sets of wheels and touched me as he went past at about 30 miles an hour on the grass. Perhaps being a smart ass, but frighteningly dangerous for him as well as for me in retrospect, and only a CB idiot would probably take that on. The name Leonski, 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 the Leonski murders, which Jeff 3VJS has done a bit of research on and of course has stood at the grave. Now, I'll just see if Jeff is there or whether he's having his shower. VK3VJS and the group VK3AML.
I've been trying, Chris, but I've been hanging around. And not only have I stood at the grave of Leonski with my two friends, Lynn and Laurie McLeod, Laurie being the son of the late Norm McLeod, VK3 November Mike, I have also been to the three sites where Leonski committed his crime. A store, a real old store in Victoria Street, Middle Park, in behind what is now renamed back to the Bleak House Hotel. He was drinking there and he was catching a tram. A tram terminates there to take him back to Camp Pell when he murdered, I think that could have been his first one. I think it was Pauline Thompson from memory. And his second victim was in a boarding house up in Spring Street near Little Burke Street, which is long gone. She'd only just made it to the front door when he strangled her. Now, was that Ivy McLeod? And as a coincidence, Laurie and Malcolm McLeod's mother, her name was Ivy McLeod. But it wasn't her, of course. And then his third and final victim, he strangled in a trench off the street that runs along the eastern boundary of Royal Park. It's in the back of my mind, Chris, but I can't pull it out. He caught a tram out there and got off and was walking back to the camp, and he strangled her in a slit trench. And he got back into his tent with his other chap that was sharing the tent with him, all covered in clay and everything. Eventually that chap said, well, my tent mate or buddy It's covered in clay and everything, and of course the jig was up. So I've visited those 3 sites, and I've also... I can't help it. Once I get the bone between my teeth, I'm like a terrier, Chris. I've got to pursue it to the very end. I've also tracked down their graves. One at the Warringal Cemetery in Heidelberg Heights, not far from the Austin Hospital, and the other 2 are out at Faulkner, and I have photos of the said 3 graves. And I've also got a beautiful photo taken at Royal Park looking across where they found the body, and the houses in the background haven't changed. They might have had a coat of paint, but they're still 1942 houses. In the Sun News Pictorial many years ago, they had a double-page centre spread on various crimes and things committed, I think in Melbourne. I wouldn't swear to that, and I've collected each and every one of them. And I saw that photo, so I went out there with my Zenit 35mm camera and took a photo from exactly the same place as what the photographer for the Sun News Pictorial did way back in 1942. The trees grown a bit more, and of course the slit trench has been covered over. But the houses in the background are the same houses. The motor vehicles parked at the curb are a little bit more modern than 1942. And I've got all this info here. What I should do now is make up a big file like I have with Amelia Earhart and put it all in that file and mark it the Leonsky files. Oh, I don't know. There's got to be something wrong with me, Chris. I don't know. When I get my teeth into something, as I said before, I'm like a terrier. I've got to get it out and kill it, so to speak. I don't think I'll ever get to Gardner Island where they're nearly 99% sure of where Amelia Earhart with navigator Fred Noonan crash landed on the reef. I'm sure I won't get there. I'd love to, but I've just got to rely on YouTube to do that, Chris. But next time you come down, Chris, I'll get out the Amelia Earhart files, and I'll get out the Leonsky files. VK3AML and the group VK3BGS.
What were the ages of the women, Jeff?
Oh, they'd be in their 20s to mid-30s, I would imagine, around there.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, it's a look. I know what you mean by getting your teeth into things, because after seeing what Dave and I saw on Flinders Island of the old Father Shaw station, I've been fascinated by that whole Father Shaw thing. Feel very close to him. I mean, you stand in those radio rooms, and you can see, if you know how the old spark transmitter system worked. Dave made the comment at the time, I remember, it's a pity none of the equipment is here. And I said, the equipment is here, you're standing in it. I mean, the building itself, because the gear was so big, the building itself and its arrangement to keep the noise away from the crystal set receiver with the alternator and the generator and the diesel or petrol engine, whatever it was. The buildings were designed for that, so they're part of the equipment, as is the earthing structure and the antenna. Antenna base is still there, earthing structure is still there. As I said to Dave at the time, we could tap into the earthing structure, just stick a wire onto it. That would be the earthing structure for a 630 metre transmitter with no trouble at all. All we'd have to do is to supply a T antenna with a spider beam pole. and we could make a good go of that with modern CW equipment on 630 metres. And I'm tempted to do it. The property on Flinders Island that has that radio station has been sold from the Chen family, who was a prominent group of intellectuals, ex-Sydney, to a new owner who actually is kind of an intellectual cut above your average rural dweller. He's been in touch with me, fascinated by the history of the place, and I've been shunting him material. And I'm sure he'd be the sort of person to say, if you want to fire it up for a few nights again, come down. So I'm tempted by the thought. Plus I could catch up with a lot of old friends on Flinders Island that I made over the years. Those that are still alive, a lot of them are lying under the sod in the cemeteries of Lady Baron, Whitemark and Emitter. I stood at Derek Smith's grave, for example. He died in 1999, pardon me, and he's buried at Emitter, not too far, about a kilometre away from that old Father Shore station. Near the Waibalena Aboriginal settlement that used to be there. It's an interesting place, a very interesting place, and I hope if any of you have the opportunity to go to Flinders Island, for goodness sake, take it, because it's, as you could see, very beautiful. A lot of it's untouched, and the people there, because they're isolated and how can I put this? Many of them are intellectually thirsty, and when somebody comes to the island that is, in inverted commas, interesting in one way or another, quite often you'll find yourself invited for dinner and chats and drinks occasionally, as Dave and I had with Judy Jarks, who's was well known in the pop music field in the 60s and 70s, particularly on television locally. She's retired there with her fella, Sandro Donati, is a trumpeter, very good trumpeter. So Dave and I went to dinner with Judy and Sandro, and after dinner we had the extraordinary experience of Judy singing and Sandro playing ukulele. Invited us to sing along. I declined. I have a voice that is enough to fracture glass, unfortunately, when singing. VK3ECG and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML. VK and the group VK3ECG. Yes, fascinating. Yes, I went down to Brumby Island, I think, once, and when we were touring Tasmania, and it was being run by some musicians, sort of little bed and breakfast place, and they I think did a lot of a cruise ship type stuff during the right season, and every meal, the evening meals were all accompanied by their little cabaret act, which was quite fascinating. But yes, and I always take this view that anybody can sing actually, but I have met one or two people who were definitely tonally challenged, if you want to put it that way. Yeah, it's fascinating. I was just looking up a bit more. I mean, fascinating that, Jeff, that you've got such a detailed running knowledge on the Leonski things. It's an interesting story, and was just having a quick look, and actually it's interesting because he was 24, I think, when all this happened, but the victims were a lot older actually. They but I think 2 were 40 and 1 31. So there's a lot of talk about being linked to issues around his mother. So maybe that sort of anger thing was something that was playing into a slightly older person. But interesting. and that's not necessarily an uncommon feature, I think. But there we are, and I like the touch about the grave facing away from the flag in Hawaii. There's a tremendous sense of ceremony and so on, and those sort of they are written rules effectively, and of course a number of religions have also had very strict rules about that sort of thing, and sacred ground and so on and so forth. But it's there's lots of fascinating stories in that sort of area. I got involved with the Ned Kelly stuff in Melbourne, and identifying where he was buried when they in fact closed Pentridge, and it had been closed for some time, and they started moving it to build apartments and flats up there, and the old graves, of course, all had to be shifted because executed prisoners were buried in the prison itself. And in fact, there's some of the bluestone had no gravestones. They were just the nearest wall was just marked, and engraving in the stones. And some of those stones, those bluestone stones, have actually moved and now part of the bayside walls and things like that. And people have found some of the original ones with markings. And so when they moved the graves out of Pentridge, we did some work with our anthropology people in relation to those, and yes, we found Ned Kelly, which was fascinating, so that was quite a strict sort of structure that bodies were not returned to families, and of course that's all changed today, and where they could do that, they did. But we did some very interesting sort of superimposition stuff with them, which was fascinating to try and get some identification on them. But back to you, Chris. VK3AML and the group VK3ECG.
Just before we move on from that comment, Dave, isn't it true that Ned Kelly's remains are missing the head?
Yes, that is correct. Yes, there was a skull that was thought to be his skull, but which was on display in the old Melbourne jail for a long time, and we proved that it wasn't, and I think that's pretty good, that issue. So that there was lots of talk about what happened to his skull. It's a fascinating bit of history, and there was a famous anatomist in Melbourne who was supposed to have had it on his desk at some point. It went, then the particular skull, which everyone thought was his but wasn't, was taken off to one of the anatomy museums, and so on and so forth. So there's a fascinating bit of history about that. And indeed, actually, when they did the excavations from the old Melbourne jail, where of course they were buried originally, and when they moved all those graves to Pentridge, because they're still given back to families and so on, they just moved into the annex prison. It was actually, they used an old sort of steam shovel, and all the students from the Working Men's College, which was later to become RMIT, all went down and scavenged the remains, and it caused such an outrage in Parliament that they had to change the way in which they were doing it, because people were going away with trophies of bits of bone and things like that from VK3ECG.
Do we have a breaker there? I think there was a carrier in there.
Sorry, it's me. I was putting my mic down. Cheers.
Oh, okay. One more question before we move on, Dave. Every 10 years or so, some hotshot, particularly on Melbourne City Council, talks about developing the market in North Melbourne. What do they call it? Off Elizabeth Street. The market site. I've just forgotten the name. And they don't seem to realise that was the original Melbourne cemetery, and under the asphalt there are still 9,000 bodies. Have you ever been approached about that with the present proposals to redevelop?
Yeah, Victoria Market. No, I mean, I've certainly know about that, and certainly people were sort of saying, well, what do we do about that? I don't think anyone will be as bold enough to try and move that sort of thing. It will be just a horrendous task. And be interesting to see, obviously from an archaeological point of view, what remains were there, but I suspect they wouldn't be moved. I wouldn't have thought, although if things became uncovered during the process of the building, then obviously there's something would have to be done, and they would be treated appropriately, I'm sure. It's interesting, the discipline of sort of archaeology in the UK is incredibly well funded, and it's well funded purely because anybody who builds anything in any UK city just about has got a risk of coming across Roman remains and ancient artifacts, and they have to employ archaeologists as part of most major building projects to actually cope with that, because if they come across some Anglo-Saxon site or something like that, they have to stop all building work, and it must be officially excavated. And of course that can take some time to organise. So these companies, in preparation for this, actually organise that sort of thing in advance, just in case. So there are a whole load of university archaeology departments on various retainers at any one time, which actually makes them a good income from VK3ECG.
Yeah, I know a little bit about the Victoria Market situation. My mother, who was born in 1912, frequently said to me that as a kid up the north end of Elizabeth Street, she'd wander through the cemetery that used to be there, and they apparently progressively moved most of the marked graves, which unfortunately after 50 or 60 years, not many of them were still marked, because the original markers in the early days of Melbourne were mostly wood, and they either burned or rotted in the interim. But the marked graves were generally moved to Fawkner Cemetery between 1917 and 1922. But apparently there are 9,000, to my knowledge, that are still unaccounted for and still under the asphalt. And one particular one, I had a map that I got from a turn-of-the-century publication and took it into Victoria Market and overlaid it on a present site map and Google Earth so I could work out where the various sections of graves were. The Aboriginal section, which really will cause huge political problems if they start to move that. Can you imagine the outcry? I shouldn't say this perhaps, but it's underneath the nut shop. I mean, any more invidious end for the final generation of Aboriginals who owned the Yarra Yarra tribe, who owned Melbourne area, who are supposed to have signed it off to John Batman, are there. And the thought of the politics that would cause if they excavate underneath that nut shop, God, it's just frightening. I don't think the Jewish people would mind. I don't think the Jews have an idea about the resurrection of the dead on Judgment Day. I don't think that's part of the Jewish ethos, so probably the bodies aren't so much of a concern. They're Protestants and Catholics perhaps more so. It's an interesting one politically, socially, and what it means in terms of the development of Victoria Market, because invariably every 10 years, we're going to develop Victoria Market, and then they do a site reconnaissance. It's the last you ever hear of it. VK3ACZ and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group from VK3ACZ. What a rather marvellous discussion we've been having. I've just been taking all this in with relish, hearing about Ned Kelly's skull, old graves and the such like, just absolutely fascinating. And Leonsky, yeah, I've got that burned into my memory now. Not that I really need to remember the name as such. He doesn't deserve any kind of honour at all. But On the same subject with old graves at Williamstown, there was the original graveyard was right on the foreshore there at what we used to call Shelley Beach, or the back beach at Williamstown. And in 1971, if I recall correctly, they all were exhumed and moved to the Williamstown General Cemetery, 926 bodies. I just remember that because there's a big gravestone marker of it all, and they're stuck in the one great big vault. A very undignified end, but what it was all reminding me of was those catacombs in Paris, where you go down, I don't know, something like 20 metres underground. And Dave, I'm sure you've seen it all too, the line of femurs, and then the line of skulls, and then the line of whatever other bones there are. And that was from the 1700s, when the cemetery was leaking into the water table, and not good when it's your drinking water. So all the bodies are exhumed in these cemeteries and put down in the down in these catacombs. And of course, I don't know, somebody with an artistic bent or flair decided to stack them all in very interesting piles. But anyway, that's enough of all that macabre sort of talk. I'll put it back to you, Chris, for something more appropriate, I hope. Hi, VK3AML on the group, VK3ACZ.
Well, we've dealt with violence. We'll have to move on to sex or politics. It's a bit late for that. I'm relieved to say that after 3 hours and 7 minutes, there has not been a single drop frame this week. And the only thing I've changed, and this is over the last week and this week, that have both worked well, and I don't know why this works. I get into Firefox, the browser that I use for the OBS software, and I completely erase its cookies, its memory, and its stored materials. Clear the vault of that, and for some strange reason, that makes YouTube live stream like a dream. I don't know why. I don't know whether the cookies are causing a slowing up of the system. It's very odd, but I'm slowly learning the tricks of this, and that's one trick I wasn't expecting. Canva, and a Chinese version of Zoom with no time limit. Interesting, Dave. Ned Kelly I'd heard about. Of course, there's that death mask that they've got, Melbourne jail. Do you know, years ago, funny one, there was a girl I was rather keen on. This is about 1979. And she worked at RMIT, so she was fairly close into the city there. And I was trying to impress her with my intellectual prowess. God knows the body's not much to be desired for, so I had to impress her somehow. So I suggested that we should go for a lunchtime break for a look round the old Melbourne jail. Well, it wasn't what I was expecting. It was depressing and full of death masks. And I said goodbye to her at the front door of the old Melbourne jail. And that's the last I ever saw of her, and that was 42 years ago. So I learnt my lesson. If you've got a macabre place to visit, don't take an intended paramour with you. I don't know what possessed me, really. I'll just check on the text chat here. Oh yeah, John Young says the eastern boundary of Royal Park is called the Avenue. I thought it was called Royal Parade, but anyway, maybe I've got the wrong side there. Royal Park. Just hang on a sec, put that back there. No lost frames at all, and it's working well. Good. I'm starting to run low on things to talk about, to tell the truth. Probably scratching for crumbs with the Victoria Market thing, but I've always found that Victoria Market thing fascinating because I believe that's where John Batman's grave was. I think the grave has been moved to Fawkner, or the body has, or whatever's left of it. But the gravestone is the only marker remaining from the old graveyard, and it's standing on one side of the car park of the Queen Vic Market. I've taken photographs of it. It says something to the effect of John Batman gives his birth and death dates. I think he died 1839 or sometime very early. Not a particularly nice person. He was a bit of a bounty hunter in Tasmania before he came over, and wasn't a very nice person there. But the word circumspice, which means look around you, is below the name, and that sort of rings a bell with anybody who is into Latin. My father was a teacher of French and Latin, apart from English Lit, which is where I get a bit of interest in it. Usually, if you have some sort of a Latin background in Latin languages, you can work out what the roots of various words are. And quite frequently, watching things like Millionaire Hot Seat, I've worked out the meaning of an obscure word by trying to work out what the Latin roots of the word are. Sometimes they're Greek, and I'm up shit creek. Okay, I'll hand it round to Jeff VK3VJS if you're there. If you're not, VK3ACZ. VK3VJS, are you still with us, Jeff? VK3AML.
VK3AML in the group, VK3VJS. Yes, I'm still here. And it just came to me when that other chap mentioned a street. Yeah, it's Gatehouse Street. Gatehouse. Still called Gatehouse. That's where Leonsky strangled his third and final victim in a slit trench off Gatehouse Street. Yes. And the whole thing was that General Douglas MacArthur, who was headquartered in Melbourne, down Queen's Road, decided that things were getting out of hand. And after Leonsky was found guilty, he did the Nero thing that they do at the Colosseum, thumbs down. He said it was the only way to try and maintain law and order amongst the ranks. So poor old Leonsky went to the gallows. And I've stood on those gallows, and I had to correct the guide who was rambling on, and he said Leonsky strangled 4 or 5. I said no, he only strangled 3, and I rattled off the names. And he looked quite... he didn't look upon me with any great affection, let's put it that way. But I knew I was right.
Well done,
3
Jeff.
accredited victims, and possibly other that were attacked but got away and didn't say anything about it. As a matter of interest, Charles Lindbergh and his wife are buried on the Hawaiian island of Maui, which I found very interesting. I've got a book here on Charles Lindbergh, and he decided to get away from it all and be buried at Maui. Quite a nice touristy island. And I've got a card here in my hand, Chris. I may have photostated and sent this to you or given it to you. It's a card from Victor Romeo 6, Tango Charlie. Now, Victor Romeo 6, Tango Charlie was Tom Christian of the famous Mutineers of the Bounty on Pitcairn Island. He had a radio contact with VK3 November Mike on 14 megacycles at 0828 GMT on the 21st of November 1957. And Tom was using CW 5/8-9, or 5 by signal strength 8-9. The receiver Tom was using was a HQ1208, and the transmitter was the DX35 running 65 watts to a dipole antenna. P.O. Box 1, Thomas Christian, Pitcairn Island. I've always had a thing about Pitcairn Island. I would have loved to have gone there. So I've got quite a few articles on Pitcairn Island, and I even sent some money over there, and they sent me their tourist book all about the island. It's very interesting. very, very interesting. But it's a very hard island to get to, of course. You can only get to it by ship. And then you've got to get into the longboats and then brave the waves and whatever, and the landing at Bounty Bay. But with all this incestuous thing that was going on Pitcairn Island a few years ago, I've gone cold on the idea. But surprise, surprise, if you look at Google Earth, they landed a young bloke there with a backpack, and he's walked the island. I don't know whether anybody offered to drive him round in their little quad bikes or their Apollo bikes or whatever they've got there. But he had to, as far as I could see by the shadows, he walked the island, and you can, if you've got the time and patience, you can go all over Pitcairn Island on Google Street. And when he was leaving, he set the camera up down at the wharf, and all the Pitcairners are there, and a young bloke, a tall young bloke, who's obviously the chap who carried the camera around, is there. They're down there with their quad bikes and their Apollo bikes. That's the safer version of a quad bike. You're buckled in, and if you roll over, you've got a protective cage. But all the faces of the islanders, every man jack of them, even the kids, their faces are blurred for some reason. Now, they've gone to Pitcairn Island, Chris, and I find it very amusing. They have not gone down to Flinders Island. I was trying to find Gavin's place, VK7 Victor Tango X-ray, but I could only do it from the air. I couldn't do it from a street view because for some reason they haven't outlaid any expense to go down there. I don't know how they work it out, but they've done Pitcairn Island, but they haven't done Flinders Island. I don't know about King Island. I don't know. But there you are. At any rate, I must go clear and go and have this shower. What is it? Oh, crikey. It's nearly 1 o'clock. But it's been interesting, Chris. And I looked at that photo you sent me of Queenscliff, and of course that was taken a bit before my time, 1850. It wasn't until the 1860s, and then from various periods right on to probably the 1890s that the fort evolved, Chris. Now there's a row of houses. I think there's 4 houses, and they're all the same. They were obviously some sort of barracks at the time. But I looked at a later photo. I was looking up the View Grand, the grandparents' hotel, and then of course I had to wander up to Shortland Bluff to today's fort, and those houses have gone. That's in that photo you sent me. But it was a long time ago, of course, but I would presume they may have been barracks of some sort at the time. But very interesting place, and you're quite right, it would have been taken from the Black Lighthouse. So thanks for that, but I can't help you anymore, Chris. As I said, it's a bit before my time. I didn't come along till 1939, so there's a fair bit of water through the rip over that period. I better cut clear and go and have this shower, Chris. And all the best to everybody listening. This is VK3ASE, off and clear. And we'll catch up with you later, Chris. Thank you very much. VK3AML, VK3ASE.
Yeah, all the best to you, Jeff, and thanks for that, and thanks for coming up, VK3ASE, VK3AML. Just for the sake of the group, I'd mention the photo that I sent Jeff is one of a series that's recently been uploaded by the State Library of Victoria from a collection of stereoscopic, that is 3D, wet plate photographic negatives taken between 1859 and 1862 by a photographer named John H. Jones, and being wet plate and very slow emulsion, they're virtually grainless, they're in good condition in general, and they show views of things we never thought we'd see in photography. For example, Batman's Hill, which was bulldozed away or dug away to make way for Spencer Street Station in, I think, the 1880s, is seen in these views of 1859 or 60, and there's a house, there are two houses on that hill, and I'm sure that one of them is actually John Ratman's original home. And when you think about it, 1860, Melbourne had only been there for 25 years, and it wouldn't take very much for an early timber dwelling to last 25 years from 1835 through to 1860. So we're seeing things in those photos that we have never seen in photographic record before. And that particular photographer travelled a lot. He took photos in Echuca, in Deniliquin, of all places. You can imagine what that was like in 1859. There are photographs of gold miners using California cradles. There's a photograph, a very interesting one to my family, of my great-great-grandfather's foundry for producing quartz batteries in Castlemaine in 1860, which was only 2 years after he founded that, Vivian's Foundry. And of Melbourne, there's a photograph of the Falls Bridge. There used to be a waterfall in the Yarra right opposite the end of Queen Street. It was actually removed by explosive means in the 1880s to stop the regular flooding of Richmond that had occurred up to then, and also to get rid of the stench of lanolin that was collecting from the abattoirs and wool washing upstream in Richmond. Must have been a very smelly place, early Melbourne. But there are about 50 photographs of that period that have survived in these negatives that have been scanned in very high definition. I'm going through them at the moment. I've posted quite a few on Facebook. You're free to. One that will interest you, Jeff, if you're still listening, is Point Lonsdale. And they're so old, 1859, the Lonsdale Lighthouse isn't there. There's a sort of a flagstaff on top of a sand dune. There is a photograph, however, of Buckley's Cave, because William Buckley, I think, was still alive at that stage, right below the lighthouse. It's still there, but it's covered up by an iron grate. I've never been into it. I don't think anybody I know has. Anyway, let's see if Peter 3ACZ is still there. If not, we'll go on to Dave and wrap up. It's coming up for 1 o'clock. VK3ACZ and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and group VK3ACZ. I think I jumped in front of Dave, but it's okay. I won't keep you long. Buckley's Cave, yes, used to go there as a kid in the mid-60s. It didn't have the grate over the top of it, and it was rather spoilt. There was the main large cave, and there were two little bits off either side, small little bits. It was rotten with the smell of urine and all that. It was fairly obvious what it was used for. When they first put the steel grate over the top of it, you could actually climb the grate and then scrape in. Of course, I was still a youngster at that age, and peel my way into the cave, so that didn't really stop us. But it also had bats. That was the other thing. You got buzzed by bats that were upset that you were in their property. It wasn't a huge thing. It probably went into the rock sandstone, about 15 metres tops, I suppose. And one other thing too, on the subject of John Batman, the only thing I've got to contribute there is if you've ever watched the ABC show Think Tank, which has Bruce Wally, VK3WZ, and he mentions that in one episode he's a member of the Think Tank. He says his call sign that he's an amateur radio operator. Anyway, one of the question impossible was, where was John Batman born? And most people thought it must have been England or Scotland or Ireland or something. Turns out he's Australian. So for the so-called founder of Melbourne, that was something that a few people didn't know as an item of trivia. Anyway, back over to you, Chris, and you hand it over to Dave. VK3AML in the group, VK3ASE. I'll break there, Chris.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, I have a painting in the dining room, which is just the extended kitchen, and it was painted in 1948, and it's taken just behind the Point Lonsdale Lighthouse, looking east, and you can see Point Nepean over yonder. You can see the wreck of the Time on Corsair Rock. You can see the Echidna, I think it was at the time, the pilot ship, and there's a merchant vessel approaching, ready to be boarded by the pilot. And there is a flag, a rather large flagstaff behind the lighthouse, and it is surrounded by a brick works right around, sort of preserve it. So that may be or part of the original signal mast or whatever it was in those days, I don't know, or the same site, at any rate. Now, you mentioned about your family having a battery factory in Melbourne. I have here in my hot little hand a 1.5 volt D-size battery, and it's called Stan, S-T-A-N hyphen More torch refill, 1.5 volts, made in Australia by the Stanmore Dry Cell Company Proprietary Limited, Melbourne. Now, I didn't know that we made torch batteries here in Australia. Specifically in Melbourne. This battery is very old, and it's sealed with brown pitch, and it's still holding 1.355 volts, Chris. So I don't know whether that rings any bells. You might like to write that down. Stan, S-T-A-N, hyphen, More, M-O-R, Dry Cell Company, Proprietary Limited, Melbourne. You may be able to find something on the internet. And this battery is a number 5950. And they say here it's a torch refill. I like that, a torch refill. So there you are. I just thought I'd put that in, Chris. I can't think of anything else. I'll probably think of something under the shower, but it'll be a bit too late. VK3AML in the group, VK3VJS.
VK3VJS, VK3AML. Well, you might be amused to hear it wasn't torch batteries that my great-great-grandfather was making. It was those bloody great things 15 feet high with great metal shafts in it. You pour quartz rock into a hopper in the top, and with a series of cogs, this thing, this monstrous machine, bashes the rock into dust, which you then pan to get the gold out. It's literally a Sultan battery on the rock. So, yeah, they didn't have very much in the way of batteries in 1858 when my great-great-grandfather started the Quartz Battery Company. Well, actually, it was the forge, Vivian's Foundry, which actually cast the parts for the machines for gold mining, basically. No, not electric batteries. I'll hand it round to Dave VK3CG, and I think we might be wrapping up fairly shortly, Dave. VK3CG, presuming is still there, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and group, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Yes, I think I'm going to be pulling the pin. Yes, I understand the concept of that sort of battery. We've got absolutely loads of quartz on my block. I can't walk, across the slope at all without getting great chunks of quartz, which, of course, I suppose, and the house was built on part of a mine site, so as long as it doesn't collapse, of course. I'm sure that we've got lots of gold around, although I can't see myself going out to find any of it. But there we are. Yeah, sort of fascinating. Just thinking about the Pitcairn thing, of course, and then it was the overflow there that went on to Norfolk Island, of course, which was fascinating and interesting. There's one thing that always fascinates me, is the sort of settlement of writers and sort of islands. So McCulloch wasn't who moved to Norfolk Island, and Robert Louis Stevenson went to Samoa and spent his final years there. It's amazing how many writers have actually sort of and artists have sort of found sort of later years of their lives the seclusion of an island, maybe because of their fame. They just don't want to be part of that and part of that sort of history and want to isolate themselves. It's a fascinating thought, but it seems to have been quite a striking feature of many artists that they sort of retire to a smaller corner of the world, if you like, where they are perhaps less known or unknown on different terms. Anyway, it's been a great chat this evening. Thanks very much, Chris, for those fabulous videos and the commentary, which goes so well. As I said, I don't think it was a single dot frame. At one point there was a bit of a lag, but on the video, but I suspect that was my end because I don't have a direct connection. It's only a Wi-Fi connection up to this computer in the shack. So sometimes if other people start to download a video in the house, then that causes a little bit of problems. Anyway, sympathies to everyone, and hopefully we'll be able to chat again soon. Cheers. Bye. VK3 now off and clear with VK3AML in the group. Cheers then, Chris, and everyone. Bye.
All the best, Dave, and thanks for sticking it out this late. Very much appreciated. That leaves you to tie the ribbons, I guess, Peter. Noted all the stuff about Shelley Beach, 1971, moving the 926 bodies. That really surprises me. I know Williamstown has a cemetery near the Railway Museum, I think, if the Railway Museum hasn't moved of recent times, where that big heavy locomotive is. As far as Pitcairn goes, I think the first people to land there with a movie camera were Charles and Elsha Chauvel, the Australian filmmakers, in 1932, and I've got a copy of their film, which is a combination of a restaging of the Mutiny on the Bounty with the documentary footage they shot on Pitcairn called In the Wake of the Bounty, with the local restaging of the Mutiny of the Bounty shot in the Greyhound Pavilion of Moore Park in Sydney because the regular Cinesound studio wasn't available. The only notable thing about the dramatic section of the film, which is crap, is that it was the first film ever in which Errol Flynn took part. And he's bloody awful. Thank God he improved. Anyway, you to tie the ribbons, Peter. VK3ACZ, VK3AML, and thanks so much for coming up.
Yeah, VK3AML in the diminishing group from VK3 Alpha Charlie Zulu. Yes, that the Williamstown Cemetery is just up Champion Road from the Railway Museum, where Heavy Harry H220, amongst other locomotives and rolling stock, now reside. And the original cemetery on Shelley Beach there was for the people that, especially the ones who died of scarlet fever and hadn't been thrown overboard, actually arrived on land or had passed on in the quarantine part of the final part of the voyage to Australia. And there, there's also a memorial there for a prison warder who was beaten to death by the crew because the convicts used to live in hulks at that stage and come ashore each day to do their road works or whatever else it was. I know there are a lot of bluestone buildings around Williamstown that were convict built. I even had a religious education teacher who was in their 90s who still remembered the convicts walking past along the streets with the ball and chains and all that sort of stuff. But I digress a bit anyway. Good night to you, Dave. Thanks for your contribution. A very, very interesting one, as always, but especially tonight. It's just been a wonderful, wonderful broadcast all round. And as I said before when I was up the hill, boy, I really want to get to Flinders Island now. And I suppose my impressions were so far off the mark for Flinders Island. I'm probably the same with King Island as well. I might have to mark that in on my itinerary if we'll ever be allowed out again. I just got to get through this particular lockup, not really enjoying being confined. But anyway, cheers and 7-3 to you, Chris. Thank you again, and look forward to it all happening again next week. No doubt you'll have some more goodies for us, and thank you. Good night all. VK3AML from VK3 Alpha Charlie Zulu.
VK3ACZ, VK3AML, returning for the last time, I think. Well, thank you for being there. And I've listed a number of things that I could discuss next week. One is extended bandwidth sideband, hi-fi by sideband. It's an interesting one that's coming up mostly as a result of software-defined transceivers coming to the fore. Another night I'd like to discuss and do videos on lithium battery technology and the incredible impact they've had on everything from pedestrian mobile ham radio operation at high power through to electric cars and even electric planes. Another subject I'd like to tackle, waterfall displays and their usage for audio restoration. That can be quite dramatic. But of the Flinders Island footage, you probably, in that 1 hour that I ran, you've probably only seen about a quarter of what Dave and I shot. We were there 9 days shooting all the time. It was amazing. And it is an amazing place. You can get there by air from either Launceston or Essendon, although it's a bit expensive. You can get there more cheaply if you get a boat. The freight boat, you can go over, and I think $60 each way from Bridport in Tasmania, but it's getting to Bridport that's the hard part for us in Victoria. Okay, to look at the text people, John Young pointing out Gatehouse Street is the southern boundary of Royal Park. Yes, good. Van Dan Escobar saying, thanks Chris, Saturday nights have become a much enjoyed information and history session, thanks all. Well, thank you for that, Van Dan, but it's made, from my point of view, as much by the feedback of people like yourself and Peter and Dave and Jeff that adds spice to my attempt to bake the cake. They put the icing on it. So thank you. Anyway, this is VK3AML. I'll now close unless called. I'll have a quick listen. VK3AML final listen. Anybody want to make a comment?
Yeah, I've got a little bit more, Chris.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I've got the book here, Charles and Elsa Chevelle, called Movie Pioneers by their daughter Susan. And it's very interesting. It's quite an article on the film In the Wake of the Bounty, which I have a video copy of. I didn't think I'd ever get it, but it was released, I think, by your crowd at the time, Chris. I think that's where I might have bought it from. I can't remember now, but that long time ago. The cameraman was Tasman Higgins, and they went to Tahiti and shot most of the action scenes in Tahiti, and then went on down to Pitcairn Island, of course, by sailing ship, and landed there and spent some time on the island. There's quite a few photos of the old family there, the Youngs and the Christians and everything. It's quite interesting book. And I'm sorry about that. I got taken away with batteries. A stamper battery, yes. Where I had my block of land up in Gaffney's Creek, Chris, up in the bush, there were a lot of stamper batteries abandoned through mines running out of gold, and they always had 5 heads, a 5-head stamper battery, but they could always double up and triple up, of course, and they could make them bigger, They must have been a noisy place with all those things, the camshaft lifting up those stampers and then them dropping down, bang, 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 all day long, probably 24 hours a day, Chris. As long as they could keep up the supply of firewood for the steam engine and the amount of quartz coming out of the mine, it'd be 24 hours a day. The old stamper battery. Golly. Yes, there's a lot of stuff up in the bush, abandoned up there. We've got a big boiler, dragged it out of the bush. It was made in London for the steam engines, and that's on the main road near where we have our, well, I'm not a member of it anymore, the community up there. There's a lot of interest, a lot of history in those hills, Chris, and I've got a lot of it in books and also on maps and video, of course, over the years. Anyway, thanks again, Chris. I shall make another dash. What is it? 112. My godfather. Yeah, my carriage has turned into a pumpkin, so I'm stranded. Any rate, I'll make a concerted effort this time, Chris, and head for the shower. Thanks again, and we'll catch up with you in due course when Furidan lets us off the leash. VK3AML and anybody listening, VK3VJ is saying, morning.
Yeah, there's another 7 stragglers still watching on the YouTube stream, so good night to them. And good night to everybody listening on 147.475 and on the YouTube stream. I'll be back at 9:30 next Saturday with another session of I don't know what, but it'll be something I hope that's of interest to people. We keep trying, you keep watching. So this is VK3AML on behalf of the group saying a very good evening. And thank you to the people on the stream too. I just have to work out which is the way to close the stream most easily.